Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special stream. Belisarius, Byzantium's Africanus, and for this I am very lucky to be joined, after a long hiatus, Marcus Furius Pertinax. Hello, sir.
Greetings, hello, nice to be with you, Bede. Yes, one of our, I think, I speak for everyone, our favourite generals from, I suppose we call it late antiquity, a great hero of the Justinian period, and in some ways probably one of the most underrated generals of history. I mean, those of us who know about him know how good he was, but in the pantheon of great generals, it tends to fall behind, the likes of Hannibal and Alexander and Caesar and I suppose later generals like Napoleon, etc. So a man well worth his due, shall I say.
Oh, no, certainly. And, this is, ever since I started my channel, Marcus, some years ago, this was a topic I thought about covering at some point. But what's really sort of spurred me to do it is, obviously I've titled this stream, Belisarius, Byzantium's Africanus ? And that's because I actually see some very interesting parallels between Belisarius and Scipio Africanus. And I think that's quite a novel take, because I've not really seen that before, and I thought it'd make the stream more interesting than just chronicling Belisarius's career. We can make this sort of comparison in the spirit of, say, something like Plutarch's Parallel Lives, but which is part of where I'm influenced to do this. But I actually did a stream with Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly, about 18 months ago on Scipio Africanus, and so because I'm familiar with Scipio's campaigns and Belisarius, this is why I feel informed enough to try and make this comparison.
Indeed. What would actually be worthwhile, I mean, not to obviously tell you about your channel, I mean, it's your channel, it's your choice, but I was going to say, because myself and Praise of Folly have actually talked about this ourselves in sort of private, well, not private, but like just amongst each other, we've discussed this. It'd be actually an interesting like roundtable between maybe him and you and myself, perhaps like discussing this topic like as a bit of a roundtable once we're done, because as we have mentioned, this is basically going to be a bit of a two-part series, because the Ostrogothic part is extremely unwieldy and comprehensive. So that might be an idea if you're interested in doing so, because I mean I'm a huge fan of Praise of Folly. Todd's an extremely erudite and well-read person, so that might be an interesting idea.
Oh no, certainly. No, it wouldn't be opposed to having him back on, because it's been a while since I spoke to him. The last time we were speaking was actually on Procopius and anacyclosis. So Todd is always a good person for anything to do with classics.
Exactly. And actually, funnily enough, I think one time after stream, him and I sat in the background for like an hour and a half talking, and we're sort of comparing the various successor states, like the Antigonus and the Seleucids. So he's one of he's definitely a guy who can give me a run for my money on my home ground. So I have enormous respect for him, and I mean same for you, and same for Mr. Majesty and all the various friends in our circle. But anyway, shall we?
Certainly. And okay, so just to get us started, so where did Belisarius come from? Well, he mostly makes his rise essentially as the client of Justinian. Now, before we get the rise of Justinian, Justinian is the nephew of Justin, who was the captain of the Executors, who was essentially the East Roman replacement for the old Praetorian Guard for the Emperor Anastasius. And when Anastasius is sort of old and dying, he chooses to, if I recall, there's now an anecdote, Marcus, where Anastasius is not sure who to make his successor, and he says, right, the next person who walks into the room will be Emperor. And Justinian's uncle Justin walks in, and lo and behold, he named him the heir.
Because by that point, Justin had actually become captain of the Executores. So obviously he was assuming the anecdote is true, he would have obviously been petitioning the emperor or going to inform like the council regarding something, and just as you say, Anastasius makes this comment, and then Justin walks through the door. So it makes sense. Is more my point, given that he was captain of said guard.
No, certainly, and well, obviously due to Justin's relative advanced age, the real star of his reign is Justinian, who's sort of running things from behind the scenes, and Belisarius is a captain of the Executors, and obviously I think is also part of Justinian's personal bodyguard. So you see, ultimately Belisarius' sort of initial rise to prominence is through this direct connection with Justinian, and that would be an important role in his career. later on down the line. And though it wasn't always as positive as it was initially, I think largely due to Justinian's sort of paranoia and jealousy.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And the thing is too is that there's an interesting. I'm trying to think of the phraseology now. I saw it only just tonight because I obviously was just like putting the finishing touches on my notes, and something along the lines of just Justin and Justinian are sort of, because they're related. Justin is obviously the uncle of Justinian. They're referred to as the swine herders who became emperors. They came from a particularly poor part of the Danubian frontier as well, and it's believed that Belisarius probably hails from a similar region as well. This being the confluence of sort of like the upper Danube, what they call Mesia, and so it's kind of interesting that Justin is kind of the somewhat ignorant, somewhat oafish, somewhat unrefined, and almost illiterate uncle. And then because Justinian is younger, he's the nephew, because his uncle has power being the guard, well, in the guard, and then captain of the guard, and then later emperor. Justinian's the one who's given the high education in the city. He goes to the schools and the academies in the city, and actually becomes a highly educated man in his youth. So humble beginnings, but Justinian's given the opportunities his uncle isn't. And Belisarius, obviously, if it's to be believed, comes from a similar area. They also have a strong sense of camaraderie very early on.
And
Depending where you're going to go. Oh, sorry.
So one thing I will add, is also important to remember that there was a certain epithet that is used for both Belisarius and Justinian, that they were, quote, the last Roman. And what this refers to is they both spoke Latin as opposed to Greek, which was the dominant language of the empire at the time. And they would indeed be some of the last prominent leaders of Byzantium who would actually speak Latin as their first language, because later on when we get to Heraclius, you give the formal switch to Greek.
Absolutely. I'm just trying to actually think if I can pull it up just now, because I know there's a line you can draw like on a map, Greek Latin divide. I'm not going to see if it. There's a line you can draw across basically the Roman Empire, right? And essentially, some historians give it a name. I just can't think of what it's called, but that line basically runs just past where Justinian and Justin are from, and that northern part of Media, that sort of part of the northern Balkans that sort of touches or runs along the Danube, was actually technically Latin speaking as well, rather than actually having Greek as its sort of foundation mother language. So this also sort of rings true to that claim that not only were they Latin speakers in the sense they learned Latin, but they would have been raised with Latin, and Latin would have actually been their sort of foundation mother tongue, as opposed to an adopted language as well. Just depending where you want to go with this, Pete, I have a couple of quotes regarding the birth of Justinian, if you're happy to go there quickly.
Certainly, go for it.
Because like I said before we started the stream, my two sources, well, you've read Procopius, but just for the sake of the stream, I read Lord Mahon, which is a sort of 17th century or 18th century rendition of, or rather, him writing about Belisarius in his time, and Ian Hughes, which we've both read. You said you read him some years ago, but I've reread it for the sake of the stream. And what's interesting is that Lord Mahon writes it as such, and this is him quoting Procopius. Belisarius, as Procopius writes, was born in Germana on the confines of Thrace and Illyria, but its precise location is unknown. So in his time, they didn't actually know where this place was, whereas what Hughes writes is, let me get to the page, he writes, Belisarius appears to have been born in the town of Germana, now, oh gosh, let me just get the Slavic right, now Saparevska Banya in western Bulgaria. Sometime around the start of the 6th century, probably between 500 and 505 AD. Although nothing is known concerning his family or his upbringing, it is conspicuous that nowhere in Anecdota does Procopius mention his ancestry. Now, if you want to get into that subject, there's a bit here we can touch on, but for the very least, that establishes the birthplace of Belisarius.
Oh, no, certainly, thank you, and please elaborate further as you said there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I shall. Just give me a moment. Sorry, just give me a second.
That's all right.
Although this may be due to so it's always a stack of notes, right? Although this may be due to a lingering regard for the general, given the name of the anecdota, it would seem natural that if he was not, as lowborn as Justinian, Theodora, and Antonina, the fact would have been mentioned, if only as a comparison to the objects of Procopius's hatred. Obviously, that being the facts presented in the new history, which he writes after his original work, right? I will continue, however. The theory that Belisarius was of relatively high status gains further credence when it is linked to the story of John the Cappadocian related above. Oh, it's in the book, but never mind. Where are we? John clearly expected Belisarius' wife to support John's attempt to gain the throne, yet there is no evidence to suggest that Belisarius conspired against Justinian. As a consequence, John's trust is only understood if he expected the support of a fellow noble against the Thracian upstart, especially considering the friendship of Antonina and Theodora. As we know, the wife of the general and the emperor was actually quite close. The supposition that Belisarius was relatively noble may also be one of the causes for the relative lack of criticism he received in the anecdota of Procopius. A possible reason for Procopius's tirade against Belisarius may be that Procopius expected Belisarius to move on from the conquest of Africa and Italy to the conquest of the empire itself. That he did not may have been a deep source of disappointment to Procopius, not simply because the lowborn Justinian remained in control, but also because of the benefits he himself could have expected from his former superior had he become the new emperor. Yet the denunciation does not have the same venom as that against Theodora and Justinian. Because, I mean, as we know in the secret history, essentially there's what would you call it? Procopius is unrelenting in his denunciations of both Justinian and Theodora. So that's basically what's being mentioned in this book. But that sort of establishes what we could consider a pretty safe origin story for Belisarius.
No, certainly. And just to add to that about Procopius, so just to clarify the audience, so Procopius is the main historian of this period, and he actually would be attached to Belisarius and accompany him on his campaigns. And so his Wars of Justinian is one of the most reliable sources for Belisarius's campaigns, but also, as Marcus alluded to there, after Justinian, Theodora, Belisarius, and Antonina were all dead, Procopius writes his secret history where he absolutely rips the reputation of Justinian and Theodora to shreds.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I've read parts of it, and it's very hyperbolic, and you need to take what he says in there with a pinch of salt. But yes, in the very first chapter of Secret History, it's actually called the Gynocracy, because Procopius is likening the empire's in decline because it's dominated by these two women, Theodora and Antonina. These two, former courtesans are like ruling the empire, and Belisarius, he's a cuck. He likes to lick the feet of his wife and whatever, and he's like a total simp. And he's a less man because he doesn't overthrow the tyrant Justinian. And I just think, how am I supposed to reconcile this? Like the Belisarius of the Secret History, who's supposed to be this simp for his wife, who's also a cuck, with the man who reconquered all these former territories. I can't reconcile these two characters together.
Because I'm trying to think, from what I remember, who is the accused assailant in the relationship of his cuckoldry? Is it meant to be his nephew? Is it Theodosius? I can't remember. It's a relative of his, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So she has she and Belisarius adopt a man called Theodosius, but she then has like a relationship with him, which is really bizarre.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
They go, actually, in the comments here, Theodosius the Thracian, and Antonina being 20 years older than Belisarius and sleeping with his godson. So make of that what you will.
What do you expect from a former prostitute?
So was she a prostitute in the same manner as Theodora? Was she?
Yes, no, she was a courtesan like Theodora. That's how they do each other.
Okay. Oh, there you go. Okay, yes. I knew Theodora was, but I didn't realize about that Antonina. Interesting. Okay. There you go.
Yeah, yeah. So you can see perhaps why
Uh,
Procopius was so livid against the
yeah,
two of them.
absolutely. I did know that Theodosius was young enough to be Belisarius' son. So, like, just to reference the comment there, I was aware of that. There was quite an age difference. So, yeah, there you go.
No, certainly. Yeah, but I don't want to get too much into the secret history today because
No, no, no,
a
of
lot of
course,
the
yes.
a lot of what Procopius goes over is much later, especially between the various phases of the Gothic War when
hmm
Belisarius gets recalled
But,
and what
yeah,
have you.
but suffice to say, it's probably the most unrelenting, sort of seething polemic you'll ever read in history. Like, quite literally, it probably makes Cicero's denunciations of Mark Antony look like, you know, playground material. Like, it's actually quite searing and, you know, seething in its tone, isn't it?
Or
But none.
or
Go on.
Demosthenes' Philippics
Oh
against Philip
yes,
of Macedon.
true. But I actually have a bit of respect for Demosthenes because you look at the power imbalance of Macedon and Athens, and he was kind of like, you know, he was an ant trying to like bite a dog in many ways. But just offer a bit of context for where these men come from. I got a extract here from Marn again, if I may read it. It's only a paragraph, because it sort of summarizes what this frontier territory is like. Because, I mean, for those of us who know the topic, understand what the reverberations of the Hunnic and Ostrogothic campaigns are. And when I say the Ostrogothic campaigns, I don't mean the Ostrogothic War in Italy. I mean the crossing, the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths crossing the Danube, the Battle of Adrianople and the aftermath of it. I mean, this was a difficult, probably couple of centuries if you actually go back far enough to like Decius and the Battle of Abritus. These territories have been pillaged and raided for a long time. So do you mind if I just read this one paragraph?
Certainly.
Sure. So to quote Lord Mahon, the state of so yeah, I'm basically describing the state of these provinces. So quote, these districts had suffered most severely from barbarian inroads during the preceding century, and their desolation was witnessed by Priscus when proceeding on his embassy to Attila. We found, he says, the city of Naissus nearly totally subverted by the enemy, and forsaken by all its inhabitants except for a few sickly wretches who had crept beneath the ruins of the church for shelter. As we travelled onwards, we saw the we saw the we saw the banks of the river thickly strewn with the bones of the slain. So, I mean, that's Lord Mahon, also then quoting Priscus. Goes to and that's just him talking about one city, Naissus being essentially the capital of Western Mysia, and Naissus being the modern day location of the Serbian city of Nis or Nish, and was basically a very important frontier town. Not that it applies to this stream, but Naissus is actually where the First Crusade enters the Byzantine Empire when it marches across land. So it's an important city, and for it to be described in that detail goes to show just how decrepit these provinces were at this point in time.
No, certainly, because we'll get to it next time. But the very last military action of Belisarius is that Justinian recalls him to deal with like a Hunnic raid over the frontier. So, because what didn't help is Justinian did actually dismantle the Danubian limes, leaving this frontier wide open to even further attacks and raids. So certainly that was a bit of a critical error on Justinian's part.
Indeed.
Well, from that point, let's delve into the first of the Belisarius' campaigns, which is called the Iberian War. So, to avoid any confusion, Iberia does not refer to Spain as we typically would, or Portugal. It refers to this region in what's modern-day Georgia in the Caucasus. And so this is a border conflict between the Romans and the Sassanids. And so, ever since the Sassanids sort of took over the Persia in the mid-3rd century, you've got almost these, every now and again, you've got these like border conflicts, and the two powers sort of go back and forth over Armenia and the Caucasus. And so Justinian here dispatches Belisarius to the area because alongside another commander called Citus, because the Persians have invaded Armenia and are plundering the land. And so what's happening is a bit Okay, if you look in sort of the center near where the frontier is between the Romans and Sassanids is, you'll see there's a town there called Dara. Dara was the most important Roman fort. It was a massive fortification works, and it was one of the main points of defense against Persian raids, and Belisarius is sent to sort of reinforce the area.
Indeed. And just for the sake of context in this discussion, you'll see on the map here, because it basically corresponds with the most southeasterly portion of what is modern day Turkey. If you see where these three provincial borders link up, Dara is just south of that. It's sort of right near a place called Nisibis. And Nisibis is actually important because Nisibis is a part of the Roman Empire for, I believe it's brought into Roman control from Parthia during Trajan's campaign. I could be mistaken, but I believe it comes under control during Trajan's campaign and remains under Roman control up until it's lost, I believe, in the aftermath of Julian the Apostate being killed, and the territorial concessions required in order to bring an end to that war, again, if I'm not mistaken. And because Nisibis is basically one of the most important fortified cities along the Mesopotamian frontier, it probably ranks alongside Callinicum. It probably ranks alongside Amida, which is deeper in Roman territory, and on the sort of Persian side, Dura Europus. These are all important frontier, sort of fortified frontier cities. And Dara is essentially much in the same way that sort of Constantinople's built on ancient Byzantium. They get sort of like the ruins or the small backbone of what was an old what would you call it? Sort of Assyria would be the right geographical word, like this little Assyrian or Mesopotamian settlement, and just construct this quite impressive. It's less a city and more a fortress. It just so happens to have a population center there, and that is expanded for the sake of trade and defense. But Dara becomes this heavily fortified fortress town, more or less, that is to guard the frontier and acts as a sort of a military block to the Persians being able to attack Rome from Nisibis, because Nisibis is in terms of directly attacking Roman territory as opposed to going through Iberia or through Syria, it's the quickest pathway to these large cities in eastern Anatolia. So hence why Dara was constructed, and hence why it is so vitally important.
No, certainly. And what happens is the Persians decide they need to take Dara in order to push further into territory. And so we have the first real proper battle of Belisarius' career, which is the Battle of Dara. And now this is a very interesting battle because in a way it's sort of a kind of a siege, or rather it's a defensive battle where you see Belisarius draws up this sort of trench, but in this sort of bucket shape, where you've got like the main infantry in the center, and then you've got the cavalry on the flanks. And what essentially have happened is the Persians sort of attack in these waves, which are then repulsed sort of by the Byzantine defenses. And well, obviously there's a long tradition of the Romans using trenches in battles. I mean, very famously Caesar does during his Gallic campaigns, if places such as Alesia, for example.
Yeah, trenches, stakes, caltrops, that sort of thing.
No, certainly. So there's sort of multiple phases to the battle. So when they first arrive, there's no real. There's just a general engagement, but essentially like a series of challenge fights where individual soldiers are sort of dueling each other. In the second day, Belisarius actually tries to negotiate with Miran, who's the Persian commander, trying to get them to sort of, withdraw peacefully. But Miran refuses, and so then Belisarius rallies his men for the battle. And I just want to read a speech from Belisarius in the Wars of Justinian by Procopius. So, okay, here we go. You know well that the Persians are not altogether invincible, nor too strong to be killed, having sized them up in the previous battle, and no one can deny that, while superior to them in bravery and in strength of body, you were defeated only by not obeying your officers. You now have the opportunity to set this right with no trouble, but while the adversities of fortune cannot be set right by any effort on our part, reason may easily cure a man of the troubles that he caused to himself. So if you're willing to heed the orders given, you will be immediately prevail in battle. For they come against us in confidence because of nothing other than our disorder, but this time they will also be disappointed in this hope, and will depart just as in the previous encounter. As for the great numbers of the enemy, by which more than anything else they inspire fear, it is right for you to despise them. The whole infantry is nothing more than a crowd of pitiful peasants who come into battle for no other purpose than to dig through walls, to spoil the slain, and in general serve the soldiers. They have no weapons at all with which to harm their opponents, and they only hold before themselves those enormous shields in order that they may not possibly be hit by the enemy. Therefore, if you show yourselves brave men in this struggle, you will not only conquer the Persians for the present, but you will also punish their stupidity so that they will never again march into Roman territory. And I think there's quite an interesting sort of argument he's making there, that the Persians are just like a rabble and a horde, so they're inferior to you. So in a way to sort of instill confidence in his forces, and it's quite interesting because from the sounds of it, the Persian army hasn't changed very much since the days of the Achaemenids. Then, because if it's still just this infantry rabble with their shields and bows. Is there anything you want to add to that, Marcus?
So sorry, I was just unmuting. Precisely. And what's kind of interesting is that if you sort of look at because nowadays, thankfully, the internet's replete with these things. If you sort of look at an interactive map or an interactive portrayal of the Battle of Dara, it's kind of one of those things where, given the advantage, because if you sort of take the sources, because in the end, some battles are sort of extraordinary. Thermopylae is blown out of proportion, and Issus is blown out of proportion to some degree. Like, there's embellishment regarding Alesia, and history's replete with these battles where you just think, oh, there's no way they could have brought 500,000 men, right? It's just unfeasible. But battles like Dara often are reported pretty close to what you might estimate as being true, and the balance of power here between the two forces is approximately, well, I'm loath to use Wikipedia, but just for the sake of the discussion, the Persians arrive with 40,000 initially, and then they're reinforced by another 10,000, bring up their total strength to 50. And Justinian, quite kind of unusual for battles, in terms of his forces, the proportion is roughly half infantry, half cavalry. And because he's so short on infantry, is the reason why he uses these defensive earthworks and trenches and resorts to these tactics. And what actually sort of happens in this battle, sort of largely speaking, is that the Persians, sort of, rather than utilizing the majority of their strength all at once, they sort of attack either flank in these sort of probing attacks. And you might see on this sort of little map that you've got up here is there's Hunnish cavalry on both wings, and then the Herulians are on the far left. Is that sort of each time the Persians commit a wing attack, the cavalry arms push back, and the Herulians kind of act as this mobile guard, a bit like how the Arabs actually sort of fought when they came out with with Khalid bin al-Walid and so their mobile guard tactics. The Herulians are actually using it quite a similar way, and they would keep basically counterflanking the Persians, even though they were numerically superior. And then, more or less, what sort of happens is, if you want to read more from after the speech, but should we just keep talking about the battle, or should I keep going?
No, keep going, please.
Okay, sure. And then I'm trying to think of the name of the flank commander here. Oh, that's right. Yeah, Belisarius, he actually perishes in one of these flank attacks. I think it's on the Persian right. When he's outflanked by the Herulians, and then there's sort of like a general attack across the entire battle line, after which Belisarius basically withdraws his entire force behind the trench line, and then they're pushed back again, and then sort of the Persians, because I think Peroz might be the lead general of this entire campaign or this battle, sort of commits all of his cavalry to the opposite flank, and then basically Belisarius commits to the same tactic of pulling that flank behind the trench line. He uses all his cavalry to encircle their cavalry, and then the Persians attempt to breach the center again. And it's kind of a spasmodic attack by the Persians. Like, they're not committing to a generalized offensive action that could actually overwhelm the Byzantines. It's quite a disjointed bit part, several attack thing. And as you say, it's over multiple days. But Belisarius is able to sort of bring his strength to one particular fighting spot in the battlefield, and that's how eventually prevails against the Persians, and the Romans lose a couple of thousand men, whereas the Persians, from a force of 40, 50,000, end up losing around 10,000 men. So it ends up being quite, the Persians still leave the field with a superiority, but they have suffered considerably more losses than the Romans. And moreover, the point of this attack was, because if you actually see on this map here, it often happens in history that a battle is named after a place, but they don't actually technically fight particularly close to the place, right? Whereas here, this is actually technically a sally. Belisarius is sallying out of Dara, and those kind of battles tend to be quite replete with risk, in that if you're pushed back, or if the forces are destroyed, the garrison's dead or the garrison's depleted, makes the city much harder to hold. So the stakes were quite high. And so Belisarius is actually deployed quite literally on the outskirts of the city walls, the fortified walls of Dara. And the Persians' goal was obviously to either invest Dara or to even take it. And they achieve neither. So they pull away from the battlefield. Their army is relatively intact despite losses, but they obviously do not achieve their objective in taking Dara.
No, certainly. And just to elaborate on this more, Marcus, I think I can understand why Belisarius chooses to fight outside the city, because remember, half his army is cavalry. If they were all boxed inside the city, the cavalry would have been pretty much useless in those confined spaces. So by deploying outside, he can use his cavalry much more effectively, and that's why I think he does this. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
I would say so. And the other thing too is, just as a general observation, just given the lay of the land of because the Iberian War is more than just a battle of Dara. It's quite the comprehensive campaign. That there's actually, Belisarius essentially has no reserves close by, so he has to husband his forces very well, which is preparation for many of his future campaigns, in which he finds himself in a similar position of being at a manpower disadvantage and not having extra men and reinforcements close by.
Certainly, and what is a recurring theme of Belisarius is that he always seems to be outmanned and outgunned, and so he's always got to be very careful. And one thing I do notice with him is that he's a very cautious commander. Because what's interesting is, after this battle, his men want him to pursue the Persians, but he refuses to do this.
Correct.
You could make the argument, well, hang on, an enemy are retreating, why aren't you going to run them down? And I said, well, no, the goal of this was to hold the strategic fortress on the frontier, which we've done. The enemy is leaving. And also, this is a defensive war as well. So the objective has been accomplished. There's no need to pursue them, because it's important to remember this is a very common Persian tactic. Going back to, say, the Battle of Carrhae with Crassus all those centuries ago, where literally the Romans try to pursue the Persians, then they just turn around and outmaneuver and harass them with the cataphracts and their horse archers. And so this is, you're playing right into the Persians' sort of superior mobility and cavalry tactics in that respect.
And even though Macrinus fought them to a more or less a standstill, one might call it a tactical Roman victory. Much the same thing happened there. Each time Macrinus tried to attack the Persians in, what was it? Oh no, hang on, that was the final Roman Parthian war just before Ardashir took power. But the same tactics, exist, whereby Roman losses were exacerbated by the fact that they tried to counterattack in the face of horse archers. So by this point, the Romans have learned their lessons of how to better fight the Parthians/Persians, and being outnumbered, and given the fact that Belisarius had denied the Persians their objective, which was to invest or capture Dara, with an outnumbered army, staying put was the correct choice, in hindsight at least.
No, certainly. And again, just to come back to this idea of comparing Belisarius to Scipio Africanus, again, Africanus throughout his many campaigns was also, I think, outmanned and outgunned to an extent, and obviously having to rely on what resources he could in order to achieve victory. And I also see, an appropriate level of, what I would say actually I'd say Africanus, I'd say, was less cautious and a lot more, I think, risky than Belisarius. But what I will say is a better comparison between the two is that I think both are very adaptable and innovative in the tactics and how they fight their battles.
Absolutely. I would say that, if I was to sort of judge that accordingly, I think Belisarius is more cautious, but I think also Belisarius is more innovative. Although on the basis that, I say that with the qualifier that the Roman army of the 6th century is a different creature to different creature to Scipio's army. Like in the end, he's fighting with a republican force of Velites, Sastati, Principes, Triari, which has to be sort of fight a certain way. It has limitations. He didn't have Bucellari, he didn't have Cataphracti, he didn't have horse archers, he didn't have Herulian and Hunnic auxiliaries. You know what I mean? Like Scipio didn't have armored Plumbetari. Scipio had a lot less variety to play with, aside mercenaries notwithstanding. Think like Massinissa and the Numidian cavalry, etc. But I think if you look at how Belisarius fights across his career in the Vandalic War, the Ostrogothic War, the capture of Naples, the Battle of Decimum, etc., Belisarius' impressive improvisation. I dare say, in terms of his inventiveness, he's probably arguably the best general the Romans have had since Caesar, because Caesar was very much a master of improvisation and innovative tactics and that sort of thing.
No, certainly. And so you mentioned there Ad Decium. So this is pretty much the only other sort of major battle Belisarius takes part in as part of this Iberian War. So after... Actually, let's go back to this map quickly. So,
Ad Decium is in the Vandalic War.
Oh, sorry. I'm missing. Okay, my battle's mixed up. Sorry, Callinicum is what I meant. Sorry.
Yeah. Which is also you see on this map here as also Leontopolis. It's the same place, but yeah.
Yes, this is further in. So what happens is, because they can't get Dara, the Persians try to circumvent the city by just pushing through into Syria, and so they go in with their forces. Belisarius is sort of shadowing them, but because the Persians outnumber him, he's reluctant to engage. And again, like with the aftermath of Dara, his soldiers pressure him to enter and go into battle with the Persians. And well, again, Belisarius is understandably, wanting to be cautious and not take unnecessary risks. So I just want to read again from the wars with a speech Belisarius gives to his men. So, okay. O Romans, where are you going? What has happened to you that you are intent on involving yourselves in unnecessary danger? Men believe that there is only one type of unalloyed victory, namely to suffer no harm at the hands of the enemy, and this very thing has been given to us at present by chance and by the enemy's fear of us. Therefore, it is better to enjoy the benefit of our present blessings than to seek them when they have passed. The Persians, led on by many hopes, marched against Romans, and now, with everything lost, are fleeing from us. If we compel them against their will to abandon their plan, to withdraw, and force them to come to battle with us, we will win no advantage whatsoever, even if we are victorious. Why should one rout an enemy in fight? But if we fail, as may happen, we will be deprived of the victory that we now have, not robbed of it by the enemy. But flinging it away ourselves, and also we will abandon the land of the emperor to lie open hereafter to attacks of the enemy without defenders. Moreover, this also is worth your consideration, that God likes to help men in dangers that are necessary, not those that have choose for themselves. Apart from this, it is also true that those who have nowhere to turn will fight bravely, even against their will, while the obstacles that we will encounter in a battle are many. For a large number of you have come on foot, and all of us are fasting. I refrain from mentioning that some even now have not arrived. And so essentially, the Persians are actually withdrawing from Byzantine territory back into their own, and this is why Belisarius is saying, "Well, look, we've driven them out. We're supposed to defend the frontier. This is completely silly for us to go pursuing them." But in the end, he ends up caving to the pressure of his troops, and then we get the Battle of Callinicum, which ends up being a Roman defeat. And I think pretty much, I'd say Belisarius' only real defeat, other than maybe you could say the sack of Rome in the Gothic War.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this has all the hallmarks of this kind of feels like obviously the outcome of the battle is different and there's less at play, but definitely has that sort of equivalence of Pharsalus with it. Like Pompey had the right overarching strategy of letting Caesar's forces sort of rot away and eke into being beleaguered and pestilence ridden and vanishing into the ether, but the Senate demanded blood essentially, and we have to defeat Caesar honorably, yada yada yada, and we have to have a contest of arms. And you can't fault these men for trying to you might say take into account other considerations, and to win on the field with an army that has impetus and has enthusiasm and a desire to fight. But sometimes the commander in these instances do know best, and I think Belisarius knew that because he didn't have reinforcements nearby and because he was outnumbered, Well, actually, and just as I mean, I don't know whether this is just sort of apocryphal or whatever, but I have read about this campaign, the march from Dara to Callinicum, is that whenever he had his cavalry sort of screening the Persians and sort of marching in the hills along the river, like because obviously this battle takes place on the banks of the Euphrates, is the Belisarius, whenever he had his scouts and his sort of cavalry squadrons deployed, he'd have the infantry give them a portion of their banners to the cavalry and make it appear as if there was more cavalry present than what there actually was to intimidate the Persians, to keep them at bay. So again, that being indicative of Belisarius's improvisation. But I wonder what your thoughts are regarding that sort of comparison to Pompey and Pharsalus and bowing to that pressure of his subordinates.
Oh no, that's a very apt comparison. And what I will say is, if I've got any real criticism of Belisarius, is that I do think, as we'll get into with his campaigns, he does have a bit of a weakness to the pressure from his men, and this isn't the first time that he gives in to pressure from below, which would end up backfiring on him. Thankfully, most of the time it's not catastrophic, but it's still a weakness, I think.
Absolutely, and the fact that he's able to retreat from Callinicum with sort of not too bad losses. I mean, actually, technically speaking, the losses are heavy on both sides. But the fact of the matter is, he keeps his forces intact, and the fact of the matter is that I mean, what really affects Belisarius here at this point in his career is that he is in the rout, you might say, of the Byzantine army. The several commanders are lost in battle. Longinus, I think, is killed. Stephanicus is also killed. So these are sort of like early sort of subordinates that have fought alongside Belisarius's early campaigns, particularly fighting the Battle of Dara, and they fall. The other thing to keep in mind here is that essentially the spine of this force is 12 to 15,000 Byzantine infantry and cavalry, which basically is the fighting force from Dara, but it is supplemented by 5,000 Gharsanid cavalry, Gharsanids being Arab Christian allies, who have an important role in this time period and become quite famous in the next century, fighting with Heraclius and resisting the Arab invasions, etc. But the Gharsanids are a very loyal, you might say, federati of East Rome at this point. And then there's like 2,000 Anatolian infantry that are sort of bought as a last-minute reinforcement to Belisarius, but these reinforcements don't really sort of affect the outcome of the battle. And what you actually see here is, per your diagram up here, what the Persians basically do is they sort of overload, because it's essentially an almost entirely cavalry force. They overload the flank, the far left flank, which is sort of away from the river, which is where the Gharsanids are, and the Gharsanids are armed much more lightly than the Persians. They fight in a different way. Eventually, the Persians, because they've overloaded their far flank, they push back the Gharsanids. They turn the Lycaonians, who are the Anatolian infantry, and eventually the Belisarius knows the battle's lost, and so essentially using his own Roman forces, basically fights a rearguard action. Petrus, who commands the Roman infantry, sort of crosses the river, managed to extricate the Roman infantry from the battle, and Belisarius engages in this fighting retreat, but it ends up being quite the disaster. Had Belisarius actually kept his forces intact and either not fought the Battle of Callinicum or pushed the Persians back or done something different, he actually would have been in quite a strong position. But this battle it's not a catastrophe, but the outcome strategically is kind of disastrous. For Roman prospects in this theater against the Persians.
No, certainly, because what happened? Oh, sorry, carry on.
So I was just going to say, because also not long before this, I believe it's within 6 months. It's the summer of 530. A battle happens. So Callinicum is, well, actually, it occurs just after Callinicum. So Callinicum is fought in June 530, and later in the summer of 530, a battle is fought in northern Anatolia at a place called Satala. Satala's near modern-day Erzurum, which is Roman Theodosiopolis, which is just off the Pontic coast. If you see a map of Anatolia, you'll see it's sort of south of Trapezus. And anyway, again, the Romans are outnumbered roughly 2-1. So this is the Sassanids with their Persia-Armenian allies, and with a force of 30,000, they attempt to capture this city, which is Satala, and also to capture this other city, Theodosiopolis, because they're basically like the gateways to be able to cross the Pontic Mountains from east to west. And much like the Battle of Dara, a inferior Roman force, and this is actually commanded by Citas and Dorotheus. So this is Citas that we were talking about before, with half the numbers, pushes back the Persian army, doesn't take the bait, fights a successive defensive battle, and again, much like what happened at Dara, the Persians were defeated. They leave the battlefield. They retreat eastwards, and again, and this is probably due to the seniority of Citas and his experience, basically leaves the Persians. They don't harass them. They don't harry them. They don't chase them down. They're content with their defensive victory. They're happy to hold those two key fortified cities, and they let them go. And as the next winter comes along, the Romans, probably feeling a bit of confidence from the victory at Dara and at Satala, probably these junior subordinate commanders have a bit too much eagerness, and as a consequence, the bait's taken to Callinicum and the Romans are defeated.
Certainly, thank you for that further context you provided there. And what this results in is the so-called Eternal Peace, where Justinian negotiates with Khusro I, the Shah of the Sassanid Empire. And so the Romans will pay tribute to the Persians in exchange for peace, and no territory is exchanged. So, okay, it's good to know that no territory is lost, but, having to give away vital gold, which, could have been used for other things, is I think very frustrating from the Roman perspective, especially with Callinicum was such a unnecessary battle. And what also, because longer term, we'll get this in the next stream, but there's a second war later against the Persians called the Lazic War, and this is over this region again of Georgia in the northeast. And so, one thing
you see
I
on
will
this map
say
here, it's right at the top there. It's just beyond the Roman frontier, right in the north. What is modern day sort of western Georgia.
Yes, and one thing I'm going to criticize Justinian for is that I can get why he negotiated this peace, because obviously he wanted to go ahead with his, Renovatio Imperii. I want to go off and reconquer all these former provinces. But in order to do that, I need to secure my eastern front, and if that costs some money, so be it. But ultimately, the Persians would end up breaking the Eternal Peace anyway, and he would end up having to redeploy Belisarius to this front to fight them off later, taking Belisarius away from the Italian front after he'd just pacified Italy and after the first few years of the Gothic War. And I think this is a real strategic blunder long term, because I think Justinian should have fought this for longer to ensure that the Persians have been significantly weakened, to make sure that you're not having to just bleed money into your enemy who are going to betray the peace anyway. I mean, what do you think of that, Marcus?
Yeah, much the muchness, but I mean, the Romans have a history of, and when I say history, I'm talking like in this sort of latter portion of the history, basically from a time period, certainly post Adrianople, where the Romans do reckon with utilizing diplomacy and what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word for it when you sort of like pay enemies off to not attack. I'm trying to think of the word. Tribute. Like paying off tribute, obviously not from the status of being a vassal or from the status of being a subject, but in order to sort of essentially buy off the enemy's aggression. They did it with Attila, they did it with the Goths, and there's obviously a history that then develops in Constantinople, throughout the Byzantine period. We sort of see this, written about by Emperor Constantinos Porphyrogenitos, when he's in his work De Imperio Ministrando. A lot of these opponents, or at least neighbors of the empire, are in varying degrees paid off and played off against each other. Notably, the Pechenegs, the Cumans, the Kievan Rus. We see a lot of this, right? The Khazar Khaganate. It happens time and time again, and so when you look at some of the sums, however, that are sent, and particularly in the case of this Persian treaty, and you think that this isn't just a step to right. This isn't the Bulgars. This isn't the Kievan Rus or the Cumans or whatever, or the pick any of these steppe people. It's the Persians, and the Persians are already a superbly wealthy and powerful nation in their own right. One would argue that Sassanid Ctesiphon or Seleucia would be a rival to Constantinople as a great city, and so one could argue whether it was the correct decision. And I certainly think that the forced outcome of Callinicum probably made it a more difficult proposition to argue against this, as in from the Roman perspective. But yeah, I don't know. I think again, history is one of those things. You can't be too unkind in the powers of hindsight to our predecessors in history. But I think the Romans would have been better off personally sending more forces, committing more to this theatre, and at the very least fighting the Persians to some kind of, if not a complete white peace, trying to think what's that Latin phrase? Status quo antebellum. Yeah, status quo antebellum. Then at least a far milder treaty, if that makes sense. I think the sums were far too great, considering also that there's just this ascendancy that's occurring in Constantinople. There is this period of stability that occurs after Arcadius and Anastasius, and throughout this period leading up to Justin and Justinian, that economically speaking, those funds definitely could have been put to better use within the empire. Also taking into account that, let's not forget, and whether we touch on this or not, maybe you might do a stream on Justinian, we talk about it, but Justinian is obviously a builder, founder, emperor. Like, there's a lot of very expensive civic works happening. And let's not even forget, we call them the Theodosian walls, but the Theodosian walls are strengthened by Justinian at this point. So that's all worth taking into account.
No, certainly. And that'd actually be one of the reasons he goes on the Renovatio Imperii, is that he wants to bring in all of this wealth and tribute from these former provinces like Africa and Italy. So because he wants to obviously invested in all these building projects like the Hagia Sophia. And so obviously from here, Belisarius then returns to the capital, and it's around this time, obviously, Justinian starts to become very unpopular because he's got his John the Cappadocian, who is his sort of main finance minister, who's raising and collecting all these taxes. You've also got Tribonian, who is his main sort of legal advisor, where he's rewriting the legal code, the Code of Justinian, and this culminates in obviously a very infamous event from Justinian's reign as the Nika revolt. And obviously Belisarius has a very key role in the crushing of the Nika revolt. Would you like to go over that for our audience, Marcus?
Regarding the revolt itself, or?
Oh, well, just quickly the context, and then Belisarius' role in it.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually put this in my notes because I didn't think we were actually. I mean, I figured we would reference the revolt. I just didn't think we were going to talk about it. But suffice to say, I'm just trying to remember from the top of my memory here. There's because it involves. You've obviously got a map of the city here, so the Hippodrome, and quite famously, this involves the Hippodrome, and it involves the the teams, the blues, the greens, the whites, the reds, and at this point in the aftermath of the Iberian War, Justinian's not particularly popular, and Justinian sort of, he does become more popular throughout various parts of his reign, but there's always this bubbling discontent. Part of it is the fact he's considered, despite unlike his uncle being educated and being raised, well, I mean, he was kind of raised in the back end of Mesia as well, but he did spend a fair bit of time growing up in Constantinople. He was educated in Constantinople, went to the academy, was much more sort of refined and cultivated than his uncle. But there's still, and I mean, you sort of see this happen time and again in Rome. You got to think, to some degree, Cicero was kind of admonished, despite being one of the great men of his age. He was seen as a novo homo, a new man, and the embedded aristocracy kind of always resent these new men who come into Rome or Constantinople, whichever one. And so with Justinian's uncle, obviously these from this sort of same type. And anyway, that being the case, there's always this bubbling resentment underneath that these new men end up taking power in the city. And so there's that. And then there's the outcome of the Iberian War, which wasn't by any means catastrophic for the Romans, the army, from a standpoint of prestige or whatever. not much damage was done, but obviously between the tribute and then the defeat of the Callinicum, there's a bit that's there. And then, of course, Justine being a builder with all these public work programs, you mentioned the Hagia Sophia, and there's others, like I mentioned as well, he did strengthen the fortifications of the Theodosian walls. This obviously puts sort of financial pressure, physical pressure on the empire. And probably in the back of his mind, he might already have plans for this, as you've referenced several times in the stream already, this renovatio imperii, this restoration of the empire. Anyway, there's resentment amongst the sort of hoi polloi, the citizens of Constantinople, and there's a real consternation when he comes to the sort of palladium of the Hippodrome, and I don't remember the exact circumstance, I do apologize, but eventually this sort of bubbles up, this resentment bubbles up into jeering in the crowd, and then sort of to and fro between I use the word crowd, but it's more like the actual teams themselves and their sort of what we might refer to as an activist in the modern day, if I can sort of use that vernacular. These sort of would-be rebels, the jeering crowds that are around the Hippodrome, and eventually Justinian reckons to making concessions, and then those concessions aren't enough, and then more demands are made of Justinian. Justinian relents on some of them at least, but eventually the sort of this bubbles up into a frenzy, and eventually there's a breakout of rioting, and parts of the city are burnt and torched, and these thronging crowds make an absolute mess of certainly the central part of the city. And if you sort of see that, you can kind of just see on this map here, there's actually quite a little what we call a secret passage from the Hippodrome. If you just read on that map there, it says St. Stephen's Octagon. There was a sort of an underground passage from the Emperor's Box into the palace complex, and him and Justinian and Theodora and his sort of entourage vacate the Hippodrome, and so for a time, Justinian reckons that his time in power is over. He can't actually find a way forward, and moreover, I want to say it's Hypatius, who's, if I'm not mistaken, I think is a distant relative, maybe not of Justinian, but he might be like a relative of Anastasius. I want to think he's in some way related distantly to like a previous emperor, or previous imperial family or dynasty, and the crowd end up nominating him. I think chiefly on the back of the blues, I think, and so yeah, the nephew of Anastasius. Thank you. I thought it was more distant, but anyway, thank you for that comment. The nephew of Anastasius. So he has legitimacy, definitely in a dynastic sense, and so the crowds are, they're torching parts of the city. They're causing mayhem. There's they're brandishing weapons. This is a very, very dangerous situation for Justinian, and we have this anecdote from Theodora, and I apologize, I don't have the quote on me now, but something along the lines of Theodora kind of like stiffens his spine just when they're about to sort of depart. You might see just to the south of the Palace of the Boucolon, which is to the south of this palace complex, there's like a little private port for the emperor, a little dock for the royal palace, and they're about to sort of leave on a ship. And Theodora essentially says to Justinian, something along the lines of, this purple garment that I wear, this shroud, is a perfectly fitting, funeral attire. If I'm to die in this, so be it. But if we leave in ignominy, but otherwise we stand and fight. And who are the two leading men who are present in the palace with Justinian? Well, it's the generals Belisarius and Mundus, and alongside a portion of the Germanic bodyguard, which is the best way to sort of associate them is these. You hear the references in the books. Belisarius commands his bucellari, his heavy cavalry. These are chiefly Germanic mercenaries that are drawn from his home region of Mysia and that Danubian basin where the Goths would have settled in past generations. There's the excubitores, which are the imperial bodyguard attached to the palace and the other imperial areas of the city, of which this is the same group of bodyguards that Justin and Justinian commanded prior to becoming emperor, and then the city militias. And so at sort of Theodora's behest, and being led by Belisarius and Mundus. Again, I didn't actually cover this, so my memory might be hazy. But essentially, they've sort of reconvened to the Hippodrome at the behest of Justinian, and Justinian basically feints negotiation. And I believe the chiefs of the Blues and the Greens are bribed to basically abandon their fans, like their people that are a part of these, what essentially double as A, thugs, crime syndicate people, and then B, partially the labor force of the city, and in some ways sort of like representative labor groups of Constantinople, and they're abandoned by basically their leaders who take the bribes from the emperor and then leave, and then the Hippodrome is locked. These soldiers under the command of Mundus and Belisarius break into the Hippodrome, and it's a slaughter. It is a total slaughter. Essentially, it can probably be said that the Nika riots are the bloodiest suppression of a public revolt or a public I want to use the right word because it's not a rebellion necessarily, but it's not a demonstration. It's more than a demonstration. But either which way, approximately 30 to 40,000 people are killed in a single afternoon, and once that is suppressed, once the Nika riots are crushed, there is essentially no tangible opposition to Justin in the city for the rest of his reign. And Hypatius, the nephew of Anastasius, is also killed at this point. Justinian wanted to actually spare him, if I'm not mistaken, but I believe at the behest of Theodora, he was later executed.
Understandably, given the threat he posed through this revolt. But thank you for that your telling of the Nika revolt there, and this is instrumental because obviously Belisarius. Sorry.
I'm just going to say, the Rongtaratu, who's commenting here, these are honestly closer to the citywide political party selling out to voters, the Republican Democrats. Yeah, essentially like the not gladiator teams, the charioteer teams, the Blues, the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, the Whites, in some ways do represent, you might say, not so much political parties, but definitely political allegiances within the body politic of Constantinople. That's a very good point. I forgot to mention it, but they're very much motivated by politics and definitely play a part within the political landscape of the city regarding, the city's prefects and the consul. And I mean, at this point, the Roman Senate has relocated from the city of Rome because it's no longer in the empire to Constantinople, and the chariot teams are a fundamental part of that. And the other thing I want to say is that just from a personal standpoint, I've actually given this talk in Istanbul. It would have been, it's now over 10 years ago, but we were shown a tour guide of the actual city, and obviously the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque are more or less next to where the old Hippodrome was, and all that's there is more or less the obelisk now that's sat at one end of the Hippodrome. And our local tour guide didn't know about the Nika riots, and I ended up telling our group about it, which was actually pretty funny. So I'm a bit rusty not having given this speech in 12 years, but I hope I did all right.
Well, no, main reason I asked you, Marcus, is I remember when you were on AM's channel doing the Orthodoxy, Autocracy, Nationality, you gave a great embellishment of the Nika riots as part of that series. So I thought I must have you do it again.
Because, I hope this one was just as good. Thank you anyway. Cheers, mate.
You're very knowledgeable, and I appreciate it. But so obviously you can see, because Belisarius is so intimately tied to Justinian, he's got no choice but to commit this great act of violence to secure his position, because if Justinian had been deposed, it's very likely that Belisarius would have been exiled or perhaps killed himself. And also another idea I actually want to explore, because one thing that's been touted about as a counterfactual is what if Belisarius had become emperor, because there's a couple of moments where I think that was possible, especially with how unpopular Justinian would become later on. And one thought I've had, Marcus, is just to point a counterfactual is, what if Belisarius at this point decided to betray Justinian? Because if you think about it, Justinian, I think, was never more weaker in his reign than at this point. Because and at no other point would he be more reliant on Belisarius than now. So it's interesting why Belisarius chooses to remain loyal to Justinian. Because if you think about it, Belisarius, if he wanted, could have sort of massacred, the rioters, or maybe even gone over to them, and maybe even had himself installed as emperor. What would you think of that?
Certainly possible, but the thing is, perhaps if there's one limiting factor, and I'm just sort of saying this purely as a matter of speculation, is that if Belisarius at the height of his power resisted the urge to take the Gothic offer at Ravenna, when he was probably at the zenith of his popularity, the zenith of his his personal powers, his reputation, even in terms of being feared by opposition, his standing amongst the citizens of the empire, if even then he didn't betray Justinian. I appreciate Justinian at this point in time was much more established, and even though he was still unpopular, I get the dynamics different. But the point I'm trying to make is from a personal point of view of Belisarius, if at his zenith, at his strongest place as an individual, did he still remain loyal to Justinian after Ravenna? I don't think he was of that character that he would have done it here. But to answer your question sort of in a more sort of speculative alternate history sense, I actually agree with you that had he done it here, this would have been the easiest time to have basically knocked Justinian and Theodore off their perch. Because you're right, at this point, him and Mundus are the saviors of the city and of the throne. Justinian has, I wouldn't say he has no support. I mean, because he always had some sort of support amongst aspects of the city elite. He was well liked within certain, particularly amongst the clergy and amongst the religious fraternity of Constantinople, amongst the patriarch, etc., or what you could call the patriarch back then, because there's obviously pre-schism and pre-Heraclius. But not to say that Heraclius was responsible for the schism. I'm just saying that after Heraclius, there's a more definitive split between Rome and Constantinople. But anyway, and he it's not as if he was universally loathed, but I do agree that Justinian at this point is particularly weak, particularly without a support base, has just been essentially the mastermind of one of the greatest acts of brutality to an emperor's own subjects, that Belisarius, were he a different man, were he a Sejanus, were he a Caesar, were he, perhaps even a Constantine, were he someone a bit more brutal in his disposition, he may well have done so.
No, thank you. And again, and just to link this back to this comparison with Scipio Africanus, but this is actually one of the reasons why I see a parallel between the two, because when I talked to Todd about Scipio, and we were talking about how Scipio eventually, his enemies turned on him, they brand him he's a traitor, he's going to become a dictator, and he's forced into a forced exile out of the city. Again, this is the same with Belisarius. People accuse Belisarius of being, a potential usurper and traitor to Justinian, and that's why he later, stripped of all his, property and, his soldiers. And again, I just think it's the same Scipio. Both men, I think, were more loyal to Rome as they saw it than any kind of ambition of higher office. And I think wanted, I think took pride in public service. And that's one of the reasons why I make that comparison.
And this is the thing, the criticisms of Rome are valid, historically speaking, and their passion for civil wars and civil conflict. There's not too many empires that can boast of having a year of 4 emperors. Vitellius and Galba and Otho and Nero, and eventually being finished off by Vespasian and Titus, etc. And a number of civil wars initiated for various reasons. But at the same time, there is this ethos within, if you could call it Romanitas, of extremely loyal generals to their quote-unquote regime. And I use the word regime not as in a pejorative sense, but that Rome had different forms of government across the ages. The Republic, the Principate, the Dominate, etc. And basically the Eastern Empire is a continuation of the Dominate, of the Dominate, right? And so, because it's like the post-Diocletian interpretation of emperorship and imperial leadership of the state. And you see it in people like Scipio, you see it in people like Decius Mus. If you go back to the Republican period, you see it in Corbulo, Nero's general who accepts his suicide. You see it I mean, I know Decius becomes emperor eventually at the back end of a conspiracy, but he does serve his emperor. His I'm trying to think who is the emperor. Was it Gallienus he served? I can't remember. But he served his emperor with distinction and with tenacity. Aurelian, served the empire well prior to himself becoming emperor, and we see it with Belisarius. I mean, not everybody is a villain like Phocas with Maurice, for instance. There's actually quite a lot of outstanding, like Hadrian served his uncle Trajan faithfully. There's several examples of this occurring in Roman history.
Certainly, and it's interesting you mentioned Aurelian there, Marcus, because I actually believe if Belisarius became an emperor, he would be like an Aurelian. He would be this great sort of military leader for a few years. Then I think because another weakness of Belisarius is that I don't think he has a mind for intrigue, and I think I see him being couped or overthrown by someone else potentially in like a plot.
I would agree with that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine Belisarius becomes emperor. He does like the Renovatio Imperii even better than we would have got historically, but then he would get betrayed by like Nazis or something. I don't know.
Exactly, yeah. And we would have had it without I think someone of Belisarius' temperament would have been a bit more, how can I say, benevolent on the home front. If you look, I mean, this is obviously for another stream for another time, but if you look at Justinian's measures, particularly in the aftermath of the Black Death, and also to some degree his mishandling the Ostrogothic War, I think someone like Belisarius would have handled that rather more differently. And I just think temperamentally Belisarius would have been a more benevolent figure. But that's just my opinion. That's pure speculation.
So something I've just got to address in the chat. I can't believe no one has come up with the name Procopius.
I was hoping you would. I was saying the exact same thing. I love Hunger, by the way. Die Merchant is a very, very intelligent and well informed fellow, and sadly I haven't streamed with him in a while, but a very, very, very good bloke, very well informed.
Well, he's a fellow med, so kindred spirits.
Indeed.
Yes, Procopius and being progressive.
I was going to say, if I ever make another alt, I might actually take that. If you don't mind me doing so, Die Merchant, because I actually quite like the idea of Procopius. But anyway, we digress.
Dear. Procoping and seething.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Well, from there, I think it's worth we move on to the final arc of this stream, which will be looking at the Vandalic War. So in the aftermath of this, in 533, 534, this is where we begin the Renovatio Imperii proper, and Justinian dispatches Belisarius to reconquer the former province of Africa. And so just to give a bit of a background information, so Africa had fallen in the 5th century to the Vandals, which were a Germanic tribe that had invaded and rampaged away for Spain, cross over into North Africa, conquer the kingdom, and then from there just turn into a kind of pirate kingdom. They take over parts of Sicily, they take Sardinia and Corsica, and they just go off raiding. And infamously, they sack Rome in the 450s. And what's interesting is that Belisarius and Justinian's campaign was actually not the first time the Romans attempt to reconquer Africa. There had been one in the 5th century. If I recall, Marcus, wasn't it Zeno who dispatched that first expedition that fails?
Yes, it wasn't the Emperor Zeno. It was quite the catastrophe. Funnily enough, these attempts to not to diverge this conversation, but just as a sort of interesting comparison, these attempts by East Rome to reconquer Africa almost have like a ring of comparison later on to the Byzantine attempts to reconquer Crete. Like, it actually took them several major attempts to eventually nail it. And in many ways, Belisarius is the Nicephorus Phocas of the ability to sort of engage in a amphibious landing and reconquer a swathe of territory. Obviously, North Africa is rather bigger than Crete, but it's still the idea of being able to land a large task force across the sea, to use the Greek word peritea, to go across the sea, land a force, capture. In this case, technically reconquering cities and provinces that have fallen beyond the empire. But what is fortunate is that they are able to use Sicily as a jumping board as a result of the friendly relationship between Justinian and is her name Amalasuntha? I can't remember the Ostrogothic queen.
Yes, Amalasuntha is the daughter of Theodoric the Great, who by this
Correct.
point,
Yep.
Theodoric has died, and it's his grandson who is ruling.
Yeah, but she has a lot of influence in Gothic politics at this time. So she allows them to use Sicily as a springboard, which you can see on this map here. That task force leaves Methone, which is in the Peloponnese, crosses the Ionian Sea, lands at Catania, which is in Sicily. This fleet then departs from Sicily, although I can't really tell if it's departing Syracuse or Catania, but it doesn't matter. The idea is it departs Sicily, crosses around Malta, lands in North Africa just south of a place called Thapsus, which is where Caesar actually defeated the senatorial forces in the Civil War. Interestingly enough, Thapsus. It's where he defeated Cato and the younger Scipio, the much younger Scipio, and then eventually you can see here by the sort of arrows of the campaign, they march up the coast, they take Hadrumetum, they take Carthage, they eventually cross to Hipporegius, and I mean we'll get into obviously the battles, but I'm just sort of saying that he does achieve this quite significant operation, because I mean naval operations are not easy at the best of times. I mean, as we saw, Caesar took 2 bites of Britannia with varying degrees of results. So this is not an easy thing to do in this time period. It never is at any time period, but just to say.
No, certainly. And in terms of preparing this operation, so Belisarius is given an army of 10,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. And the reason they're launching this campaign now is, one, Justinian is secure after crushing the Nika revolt, but also the Vandals are actually in the middle of having a civil war because the current king of the time was Gelimer, and there's like Hilderic, and what happens is Hilderic is deposed by his cousin Gelimer, because I think Hilderic wanted to have, good constructive relations with Rome, but Gelimer was more hostile, so he deposes Hilderic, and then what happens is Sardinia rebels against Gelimer, so Gelimer has to send a considerable chunk of his forces off to Sardinia to pacify it, leaving the kingdom more vulnerable to attack. And so I think Justinian picked the perfect time to launch this invasion. And so they, as you said, they stop off, they resupply in Syracuse, and then from there land in Africa. And it should be noted that Procopius again accompanies Belisarius, but also his wife Antonina accompanies him as well. And what's interesting is there's an incident where we mentioned the Hunnic allies. Well, the Hunnic allies, specifically, it's the Massagetae that accompany the Roman forces. And there's an incident where Belisarius has to execute 2 of them who commit murder whilst drunk. And this ends up angering the fellow tribesmen, and it sort of threatens to sort of unravel this allied army. And Belisarius actually gives a speech to, again, pacify the army. And so there's actually a speech I want to read from the wars. So, if my words were addressed to men who are now for the first time entering into war, it would require a long speech for me to convince you how great an asset justice is for gaining victory. Those who do not understand the fortunes of such struggles think that the outcome of war lies in one's hands, but you, who have often conquered an enemy not inferior to you in strength of body and well endowed with valor, who have experienced fighting an enemy, you, I think, are not ignorant that, while it is men who always do the fighting in either army, it is God who judges the contest however sees best to him, and who bestows the victory in war. Given that this is so, it is right to pay less attention to bodily fitness, practice in arms, and all the other provision for war, than to justice and those things that pertain to God. For that which may bring the greatest advantage to men in need would naturally be honoured by them above all other things. The first sign of justice would be punishment of those who have committed unjust murder. For if it is incumbent upon us to judge the actions that are committed towards our neighbours, and to name the just and the unjust ones, we find that nothing is more precious to a man than his life. If some barbarian who has slain his kinsman expected leniency in his trial because he was drunk, he actually makes the charge so much worse by reason of that very excuse that he claims removes his guilt. But it is not right for a man under any circumstances, and especially when serving in an army, to be so drunk as to readily kill his best friends. Rather, the drunkenness itself, even if the murder is not added at all, is worthy of punishment, and when it is a kinsman who is wronged, the crime is all the worse with regard to punishment than when committed against those who are not kinsmen, at least for men of sense. Now, the example is before you, and you may see what sort of outcome such actions have. As for you, it is your duty to avoid initiating violent exchanges or taking the possessions of others, for I will not overlook it, be assured, and I will not consider any one of you a fellow soldier of mine, even if he is reputed to be terrible to the foe, who is not able to bring pure hands against the enemy. Bravery cannot prevail unless it is arrayed with justice. And again, if Procopius has been reporting all of these speeches that Belisarius has been given accurately, he definitely seems to have had a skill with rhetoric like Scipio. He's able to sort of rally his men to him and smooth over a lot of these tensions, because again, if things have gone badly, he could have lost a significant portion of his army, which helped him achieve victory in this campaign that led to the successes over the Vandals.
Exactly. And just as like a bit of a side note, I don't want to sound like I'm being trivial. What's kind of interesting in terms of like the comparison between Scipio, and if you sort of consider that men in history sometimes share commonality, but also can do things as a mirror of each other. And what's sort of ironic is that Scipio lands from Hispania into North Africa, marches eastwards towards Carthage from the west, whereas Belisarius arrives from the east, traveling westwards. And takes Carthage from the opposite direction. So one of those interesting little quirks of history, if I just may say so. But indeed, and the idea that Belisarius is rarely what he does sometimes suffer, and in North Africa it's due to a lack of support from Justinian to appropriately pay troops, and in the Ostrogothic War in Italy, it's more of a case of occasional insubordination by Narses and sometimes incompetence by the likes of John the Armenian. But Belisarius himself is rarely, if ever, never in a situation where he faces displeasure or sort of rebellious tones from his troops. He's a very much respected and much sort of loved commander by his men, and his men trust him, they carry out his orders, and they fight with quite considerable sort of aptitude and tenacity in any conflict, in any sort of in any battle, skirmish, siege that Belisarius is involved with.
No, certainly. And so when they go to land in Carthage, they land at a place called Caput Varda, which is about 5 miles from Carthage. And there's actually a bit of an argument Belisarius has with one of his other commanders called Archelaus about where to land and what to do with like the with their supplies and what to do with it with their ships. And there's actually an exchange between the two, which again I want to read from the Wars of Justinian. So Archelaus to the War Council: I admire the virtue of our general, who, while surpassing all in judgment by far being the most experienced, and at the same time holding the power alone, has proposed an open discussion and invites each one of us to speak, so that we will be able to choose whichever course seems best, although it is possible for him to decide alone on what must be done and to command freely as he wishes. But as for you, my fellow officers, I do not know how to say this easily. One might wonder that each of you did not hasten to be the first to oppose disembarkation. Still, I realise that making a suggestion to those who are entering upon a perilous course brings no personal advantage to him who offers the advice, but usually brings him blame. But when things go well for people, they attribute their success to their own judgment or fortune. But when they fail, they blame only the one who advised them. Nevertheless, I will speak out, for it is not right for those who are deliberating about safety to shrink from blame. You intend to disembark on enemy territory, fellow officers, but in what harbour are you planning to place the ships in safety? And what city's wall will you find security for yourselves? Have you not then heard that this promontory, from Carthage to Iunki, extends, they say, for a journey of 9 days, altogether about harbours lying open to the wind from whatever quarter it may blow? Not a single walled town is left in all Libya except Carthage, thanks to the decision of Gaiseric. One might add that this place, they say, entirely lacks water. Come now, if you wish, let us suppose that something goes wrong, and let us make the decision with that in mind. But it is not in keeping with human experience, nor with the nature of things, that those who enter into contests of arms should expect no difficulty. If then, after we have disembarked upon the mainland, a storm should fall upon us, will it not be necessary that one of two things will happen to the ships, either that they will flee away as far as possible, or perish upon the promontory? Then by what means will we be supplied with necessities? Does no one look to me as the prefect charged with maintenance? For every official, then, when deprived of the means of administrating his office, is of necessity reduced to the name and standing of a private person. And where will deposit our superfluous arms or any other part of our necessities when we are compelled to receive the attack of the barbarians. In that case, it is not well even to say how it will turn out. I think that we ought to make straight for Carthage, for they say that there is a harbour called the Stagnum, not more than 40 stays distant from it, which is entirely unguarded and large enough for the whole fleet. If we make this the base of our operations, we will carry on the or about difficulty, and I, for my part, think it is likely that we will win Carthage by sudden attack, especially as the enemy is far away from it, and that after we have won, it will have no further trouble. This is how it goes with all human affairs. When the chief point has been captured, they collapse after no long time. We ought then to bear in mind all these things and choose the best course. So spoke Archelaus. Belisarius then spoke as follows: Let no one of you, fellow officers, think that my words are those of an arbiter, not that they are spoken last so that it becomes necessary for all to obey them, whatever that may be. I've heard what seems best to each of you. It is now proper for me also to lay before you that I think that we can jointly choose the better course. But it is worth reminding you of this fact, that the soldiers said openly a little earlier that they feared the dangers of the sea and would turn to flight if a hostile ship attacked them. We pray to God to show us the land of Libya and allow us a peaceful disembarkation on it. Things now being what they are, I think it is the mask of foolish men to pray to receive from God the more favourable fortune then, when this is given to them, to reject it and go into a contrary direction. If we do sail straight for Carthage and a hostile fleet encounters us, the soldiers would be blameless if they were to flee with all their might, for delinquency announced beforehand carries within its own defence. But for us, even if we come through safely, there will be no forgiveness. Now, while there are many difficulties, if we remain in the ships, it will be sufficient. I think to mention only one, that by which they especially wish to frighten us when they rattle us with the chance of a storm. For if a storm were to fall upon us, one of two things, they say, must necessarily befall the ships, either that they flee far from Libya or be destroyed upon this headland. What then, under the present circumstances, will be more to our advantage to choose, to have the ships alone destroyed or to have lost everything, men and all? Apart from this, at the present time we will fall upon the enemy unprepared, and in all probability will fare as we desire. For military affairs are mastered by the element of surprise, but a little later, when the enemy have already made their preparation, the struggle before us will be one of strength evenly matched. One might add that it would be necessary perhaps to fight even for the disembarkation and strive that which now we have within our grasp, but over which we are deliberating as a thing not necessary. And if, when we are engaged in conflict, a storm also comes upon us, as happens at sea, then while struggling against both the waves and the Vandals, we will regret our prudence. As for me, then, I say that we must disembark upon the land with all possible speed, landing horses and arms and whatever else we consider necessary for our use, that we must dig a trench quickly and throw a stockade around us, that we will contribute our safety, no less than any circuit war one might mention, with that as our base must carry on the war if anyone attacks us. And if we show ourselves brave men, we will lack nothing by way of provisions for those who prevail over the enemy, our Lord also of his provisions. Victory invests itself with the wealth and then sets it down again on the side to which she inclines. Therefore, it is now in your hands to keep us safe and bring to us an abundance of good things. So from there, what we can see is essentially Belisarius lands at Caput Vada because he wants to land discreetly, prepare a camp, and then scout and then make plans from there, whereas Archelaus, he thinks a direct attack on Carthage is better because, the Vandals aren't expecting us, and if we can take the city, we will then, have this, decisive upper hand, and ultimately the army goes to Belisarius. And it's interesting just sort of comparing this to Scipio, because again, when Scipio launches his own African campaign against the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War, he does something very similar. He lands again at like a private cove and establishes a base and then advances from there. He doesn't launch a direct attack on Carthage. So again, it's almost like Belisarius is directly mirroring Scipio in his projects. And I have to wonder if Belisarius has actually read about Scipio's campaigns and was perhaps sort of implementing them.
Oh, doubtless. And I mean, we see this time again. And when I say Roman history, I mean the entire extent of it. I mean, from literally the kingdom until 1461, and that is this sort of memory that the nation's elites has of itself and its past. And you sort of see, particularly post Vegetius, Flavius Vegetius, the writer from the 4th century, sort of lamenting the dilapidated state of the Roman army, which he sees, 5th century, I think it was writing in the 400s, if I'm not mistaken, sort of writing about the dilapidated state in which he saw the Roman army, And then if you move forward to sort of the East Roman period, you sort of see this with the Tacticon, the Strategicon, these manuals that are written by various emperors, Maurice and others going forward. And I think particularly Nicephorus Phocas basically wrote like an entire, work regarding skirmishing. And so the idea that they would be ignorant of the military campaigns of their predecessors is very unlikely. And doubtless, despite invading Africa from the opposite direction, as we just mentioned, Belisarius would have well understood. I would be extremely confident that he would have, in quite intricate detail, understood the campaign of Scipio Africanus, and would have best understood, or rather would have understood how best to attack Carthage as a city, even though technically it's not quite the same city as Punic Carthage, because as we know, the Romans rebuilt it in the aftermath of the Jugurthine War under Gaius Marius in the 1st century BC. But this would still inform him to a very profound degree as to what would be the best course of action strategically and operationally in which to capture Carthage and to subdue the Vandalic kingdom. I would be no doubt about that personally.
Certainly, but just to provide a bit of a counterfactual, in a way you could perhaps argue that if Belisarius had gone for a direct attack on Carthage, in a way is another comparison to Scipio, because indeed when Scipio launches his Spanish campaign in the Second Punic War, what is his first objective? It's the capture of Carthago Nova, New Carthage, and there's the siege of New Carthage, which is this decisive victory that gives the Romans the strategic control of Spain, because the Romans control Tarraco in the north and New Carthage down the south, and this gives them a great strategic operational superiority over the region. And so it's interesting that, ironically, in some ways, Belisarius could have been emulating Scipio no matter what course he went. Though I think if he'd directly attacked Carthage, I think that was a much more risky proposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree.
Certainly. And so, obviously, from there, he marches inland, and he sort of starts foraging for supplies. But ultimately, what ends up happening, some of his soldiers sort of pillage the local countryside, and he has to punish them, as you would expect. And the city of Silectum falls without a fight. His army marches along the coast, and they end up capturing Leptis Minus and the Hadrumentum, as we can see on this map, as they started sort of marching up the coast there. And at this point, Gelimer, who had Hilderic imprisoned, orders his death, and he plans to ambush the Romans at the site of Adesium, which is not too far from Carthage, while he's being reinforced with those of his brother Amatus. And so, as we can see here, the original plan was for these three forces, the Amatus and the Carthage garrison, marching out. You have Gibermund with some men, and then the main Vandal force under Gelimer all coming in and encircling the Roman army just outside the city. And this obviously doesn't quite work to plan, because what ends up happening is Belisarius sends a smaller force forward to scout, and this ends up encountering Amatas's own scouting force, and this ultimately ends up giving the game away, so to speak, and it allows the Byzantines to not get totally surrounded. And so again, a prudent skill of Belisarius is this prudence to actually scout ahead and not just sort of blindly walk into an ambush.
Indeed, and one thing to keep note is we talk about this detachment here that is we call it the salt pans, because I mean actually it is a giant salt pan. In fact, it still is today. It's even larger than what it was in late antiquity. But that detachment is commanded by, actually we'll hear more of him later. But what Belisarius does, he detaches a contingent of his Bucellari, which is his bodyguard, and I want to say some Hunnic mercenaries, which obviously function, like step cavalry archers. And because this is just simply sort of Germanic, sort of a mixed sort of Germanic contingent of, what was I, Germanic, Vandalic, not particularly well equipped. there. Oh, yeah, here we go. Yeah, well, it says on the map here by the Huns, but I know there was a detachment of Bucalari involved. Anyway, they rout this contingent of 2,000 men, and it's safe to say that probably very few survive. So this breaks the force apart that is meant to sort of unify the two wings or act as some kind of delaying force, because what has to be brought into account is that it's Gelimer who's returning. It says it here on the map, like the main Vandal army. So the idea that Amatus would basically act as a blocking force. Now, I mean, if we're talking, a contingent of, say, heavy phalangites, or like, very heavy Praetorians, say, like, some kind of heavy infantry unit that has staying power, it might work. But once this contingent under Gibermund is routed and essentially destroyed by the Huns of the Bucalari, the vanguard under John the Armenian pushes towards what is now the Tunisian city of Tunis. But that crossing that sort of inland lake that sort of protects Carthage from the south, which we see on the map here, that vanguard completely overruns Amatus and his Carthaginian garrison. And so Gelimer's in the unenviable position of that Carthage has no garrison now, because the force has been overrun. Amatus is killed in the battle, which basically presents a situation of Gelimer being overcome by grief, and actually in many ways paralyzes his, because it sort of acts as this sort of inner paralysis for Gelimer. He's just distraught by the death of his brother, and Belisarius plays this wonderfully. As you see on the left-hand map, if the Vandalic plan had come to pass as they intended, they would have just surrounded, and of course, had Belisarius taken the bait, would have surrounded his army and destroyed him. But what actually happens is this idea of separated contingents being defeated in detail, and essentially, not to be clumsy about it, but Belisarius managed to sort of Schwerpunkt his way to ad decimum by defeating these contingents in detail, one by one, with greater amounts of force at a particular focal point of the battle. And so Gelimer is separated from his capital city without a garrison defending it. Belisarius' army is largely unharmed, suffered very few casualties in both the destruction of Gibermund's contingent and in defeating Amatus's force, blocking force protecting Carthage. And so Belisarius is essentially able to reach Carthage before Gelimer, and then Gelimer, like I said, is paralyzed by the basis that he's basically in grief of the loss of his brother, and to some degree, you'd have to say, probably lamenting the inevitable loss of his city.
Oh no, certainly, and thank you for mentioning the bit about defeat in detail, because that is another hallmark of Belisarius, especially when we get to the Gothic War. He would heavily have to use that, because when you're outnumbered, you need to make your numbers count as much as possible. So defeating your enemies as efficiently as possible is essential. And so here's got some more slides. You're seeing the further course of the battle, where the Federati end up withdrawing once Gelimer gets contact, but by that point the main Byzantine army joins in, and ultimately Gelimer is forced to withdraw. And what Gelimer does do, though, is obviously not wanting to be drawn into a siege situation. He actually destroys the aqueduct connecting Carthage to ensure that Belisarius and his army just can't rest up and consolidate, that they're forced out. And this leads to the other major battle of this campaign, which is the Battle of Tricamarum. And ultimately, one of the reasons he does this is because Gelimer knows that his brother Zabo, who's just come back from reconquering Sardinia, is coming with reinforcements. So again, he wants to assemble as the biggest sort of army he can to then try and beat the Romans in a fresh, decisive battle and drive them out ultimately. And ultimately, what's also interesting with the city is, though there's a little bit of looting, Belisarius ensures it's not too great, because you don't want to turn the population of the city against you if you're planning to absorb or reconquer it into the empire. And that's something we'd see as well, I think, when it comes to the Gothic War, especially with the sieges such as Naples and Rome, etc. And so now to come to the the final battle we're going to talk about in the stream, which is the Battle of Tricamarum. So Belisarius ends up marching out to meet the Vandals, and what's also interesting is that the Massagetae, or the Huns, proved to actually be relatively unreliable here, because in the lead up to this, Gelimer had actually been trying to get them to defect to him, because some of them had concerns that they would not end up returning home after the campaign was over, and they'd just be kept, if they don't die in battle, they're just going to be kept on like a kind of garrison duty. And so he tries to play on their insubordination. So what Belisarius does is that he tries to not rely on too much, and what ends up happening is the Massagetae end up staying in the rear and avoiding battle, and hoping to only aid the side that appears that's going to be most likely to win. So what he does is that he ends up having to leave the Massagetae in the rear, which is obviously a very dangerous proposition considering their disloyalty. Is there anything you want to come in at this point, Marcus? Or
no, not necessarily. Just happy to sort of go along with what you're, because I don't really have anything to interject with. You sort of touched on it basically so far. What I will say though is that interestingly enough, that despite the fact that there has been the defeat of the main, or quote unquote main Vandalic army at Decimum, because of the reinforcement from the Sardinian contingent returning to Africa under Zazo, like you mentioned, there's quite a disparity of strength, and again, Belisarius finds himself outnumbered, and it's almost 2-1, probably like 3-2 to the Vandals' favor, and yet the Byzantines sort of ultimately do sort of prevail here at Tricamarum, as you say, and again, and once again in a battle, in the same way that Amatus was killed at the opening part of the battle of the Battle of Ad Decimum, Gelimer's sort of companion, Zarzon, is killed, and in this instance, rather than on the opposite side of the battlefield, is killed within eyesight of Gelimer, and more so than even the previous instance, Gelimer lost heart in a very fundamental way. So he's sort of like struck twice with this tragedy for himself.
No, certainly, and one thing we need to talk about with this battle is that this battle isn't so much Belisarius' victory as it is a John the Armenian's victory, because he's the one who's really leaning the main force, and if not for Count John's actions, the Romans may not have won this battle. So what happens if you look at this diagram? So Gelimer's marching up with his army to the sort of Byzantine cavalry led by Count John, and what happens is John sort of arrays as like a vanguard force, and what ends up happening is the cavalry are launching these sorties over this sort of river against the Vandal forces, sort of chipping away at them, and as they're sort of doing this, the Byzantine infantry and army sort of comes up behind them, and sort of what happens is once you've got the shock of the death of Zazo and Gelimer sort of retreating, this is when the whole Roman army sort of throws itself at the Vandals and causes this sort of great rout. And what ends up happening is in terms of casualties, it's so one-sided. I mean, you've got as you mentioned, it's about 2-1. There's about 8,000 Romans and 15,000 Vandals. The Romans only take 50 casualties versus about 800 Vandal casualties. So
yeah, exactly. It's very lopsided.
Yeah.
And again, it just goes to show that if there's a contingent of men that are led by in varying degrees, like a well-respected or at least a half-capable leader in the case of Amatus or of Zazo, with the death of that leader on the battlefield, you can just completely appreciate there's an utter sort of evaporation of morale and fighting spirit in the men, and this probably accounts for a large part of these lopsided casualties in this battle here. And you mentioned John the Armenian, who, as we mentioned before, had a pretty decisive role in the conduct of the Battle of Ad Decimum. He does the same thing yet again here at Tricamarum, very much the same thing, and he proves his aptitude, particularly in the case of commanding either cavalry or cavalry mixed with infantry, and moving with great rapidity and decisiveness. This is like a trend that sort of John sets for himself on as a prelude to the campaign in Italy.
And certainly, and just to sort of draw another comparison, but again, you can see comparisons in this battle with how Belisarius conducted Dara, where again you've got a numerically superior enemy, and so you sort of you sort of create this sort of terrain situation where you can kind of have a series of skirmishes with the enemy again to sort of harass and deplete them, and then you sort of throw your reserves in at a decisive moment to achieve a breakthrough.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think to some degree too, because actually I'm not sure to what degree John was a companion in the Iberian War. I think he was definitely there for part of it, but I mean I could be mistaken. But I think also having seen the success at Dara and then seeing the defeat at Callinicum would have informed, or would rather have proven to be a lesson for both Belisarius and for John the Armenian. And you can tell this in the way that they sort of command, particularly these two major battles here in Africa. They're not being passive. They aren't taking fights they can't win. And they're also not sacrificing the main body of their fighting force, which is sort of, very much a contradiction from Callinicum. Even though Callinicum wasn't a disaster, it definitely could have been worse than what it was. But they're the mistakes that they make, and they don't make them in Africa.
No, certainly. And I suppose on that note, we're going to have, there's a bit of tragedy because as what happens is Gelimer flees and goes on the run, and the Romans sort of just occupy and reintegrate Africa back into the empire as a province. And in the sort of the pursuit of Gelimer, there's tragedy because John the Armenian is killed accidentally by Uliaris, who's a bodyguard of Belisarius. So I think they're out hunting, and Uliaris, I think, accidentally shoots John with an arrow, and the wound gets infected, and John dies, and Belisarius is completely devastated by the death of John, because you've had the loss of not only a friend but a very capable officer.
What is this with Johns and being wounded by arrows in hunting accidents and dying of sepsis? It happens to be an East Roman theme, doesn't it?
Yes. Yes, and no.
For those who aren't aware, I'm obviously making reference to the Emperor John Comnenus II, because the same thing happens to him in Cilicia in the 1100s. Same sort of thing. Sorry, go on, Pete.
No. As you say, Marcus, history it doesn't repeat itself, but it very often rhymes.
I was going to say in this case it practically does, but yes, it's a general not an emperor. That's about the only point of difference, and it's on a different continent. But yes, just one thing I do want to touch on, because I think there's an interesting thing about Gelimer. I mean, I probably was a bit firm in the first battle. It's not so much he lost heart, more than I think he was astounded, and the death of Amatus, affected his ability to conduct the battle, and was probably, saddened by the prospect of losing Carthage and, his garrison being destroyed, and really putting a jam in his plans. Whereas in the case of Trichomarum, it's a different feeling. Like it's very much a sense of sorrow, because I think there's probably part of him the thought that he could fight from the mountains in the Media. There are still Vandals in Spain, and if it wasn't for the Vandals themselves, there are the Visigoths and the Suevi, who are obviously aligned and ethnically related to the Vandals. There's always hope. Whereas I think in the aftermath of Trichomarum, there's a realization that actually the dream of resistance ends, and there's a bit of after. So I don't know if you want to get into it necessarily, but one thing I actually wanted to touch on is that when he was cornered in Africa, and this comes from I think it's Gelimer writes to Furius, who acts as an intermediary between Gelimer and I'm trying to think of the general that cornered him in the hills of Numidia. Anyway, so Gelimer writing to Furius, who was the Herulian chief, and he commanded the cavalry, and you see the importance of the Herulian cavalry both in the Iberian War and obviously in Africa here. And Gelimer sort of implores him, begs him, or asks of Furius to send him a harp, a loaf of bread, and a sponge, and that the messenger goes on to explain that the king was so sort of distraught that he'd composed the song to lament about his misfortunes and the sorrow for the loss of his brother, his fighting men, and his kingdom, and that he wanted the bread because he was so hungry from having campaigned, having lost the city, lost the granaries, was fighting in the hills and constantly trying to push the Romans out of the kingdom. He hadn't eaten properly, and as a result of having been expelled from Carthage, he obviously hadn't had a bath, and that's why he wanted a sponge so that he could clean himself. Which, in some ways, and there's obviously fair bits of talk, not just in our circles, but of people just like history, sort of writ large, of how. And I've actually, funnily enough, I got a feeling Carl might have mentioned this because Carl was talking about like the effects of Christianity on the sort of the Western ethos. And like the sort of interaction between like the sort of Greco-Roman sort of philosophy and aspects of like Germanic thinking and Germanic belief. And that what's quite astounding is that whether it's the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in the Suevi in Spain, and the Vandals in Africa, this Germanic elite actually become not just very good and quite just kings on the basis of sort of implanting their sort of Germanic tribal sense of justice, and I use the word austerity in a loose way, upon a Roman kingdom, but in some ways too, that relationship is symbiotic, and the Roman people and the state apparatuses and the general culture of the place also affect the Germans. And I mean, you can't imagine necessarily an Alaric or a Ottavasser writing lines like this that are evocative and quite emotive and touch on the idea of wanting bread and water because they're dirty and hungry, and wanting a harp because they've written a song. Yet Gallima does this, and I think that that's quite intriguing sort of insight, and I think touching in some ways.
Well, yes. What's also interesting is that Gallima negotiates in exchange for his surrender. He's going to be given land and estates in Galatia, which is deep into Roman territory. So it's just interesting, isn't it? Because you'd think your typical sort of barbarian warlord, you'd want to go down, in the blaze of glory and battle covered in blood. But no, Gallima, it's like he's become relatively civilized, and now I'm just happy to retire in Galatia and just live out the rest of my days in peace.
Yeah, exactly right. And also too, I'm just trying to think of another thing I wanted to touch on. Oh yeah, so again, it's sort of interesting that what we see in Gallima and what we see also in these other examples we sort of touched on, like the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, is that they sort of somehow manage to I seem let me rephrase this. It's apparent that in some way this sort of Germanic elite that sort of finds themselves in command of these Roman provinces and have dominion over quite a sizable sort of Roman or Romanized population. In the case of Italy, they are sort of Italic Romans, and obviously, as we know, because of slavery, there's a whole bunch of non-Italic peoples who live and reside in Italy, but there's still an obviously overarching Italic influence in Italy. In Spain, it's the Hispano-Romans with Punic influences, and then Africa's obviously very Punic, very Berber, but also quite Romanized, and probably the most Christian aspect or the most Christian portion out of those three when compared. And yet you sort of see this interesting kind of middle ground where the Germans take the best of the Roman qualities within them and then bring the best of the German qualities and sort of place them on top of the Roman system, which I think is a very historically interesting dynamic, and one you rarely see in history. Probably only has comparisons probably to maybe, I don't know, the way in which sort of Cyrus in Persia adopts the best of the Babylonian system with his own sort of Median traits, and then inversely the same way that like the Persians have a positive influence on the Rashidun Caliphate and give it a sense of sort of harmony and literature and art that the Arabs don't really have to the same degree. We just don't see many examples of this in history yet. You have these very rich and dynamic examples, and it's not just one tribe in one place, it's 3 Germanic peoples in 3 separate provinces doing it at the same time. I just find that an infinitely intriguing sort of dynamic.
Well, it's you can almost say the same for Western civilization. It is the Germanic nationalities or tribes sort of living in like a Greco-Roman house, isn't it? Marcus?
Yeah, no, sorry, I just clicked off my tab. Sorry. No, exactly right. No, that is exactly the point. And in some ways, because I've actually written about this many moons ago, is that this essentially proves to be the sort of the fertile ground by which you have this sort of fusion of traditions. And I mean, I'll use Gaul just because it's easy. You sort of have these layers of Celtic Gallic, Romano-Gallic, Romano-Frankish, Franco-German, and then Christian sort of melding together. And I mean, I don't say this as a an argument for open borders and diversity. I'm not sort of saying that, but people who are proximate, people who have cultural familiarity, but are distinct and different, with compatible traits and compatible sort of how can I put this, like social and cultural ethoses that can actually meld together, that have a compatibility, and they have a like a mutual understanding of each other, and that becomes the basis of like modern day France, modern day Italy, modern day Spain, modern day Germany to some point. And this period is like, in many ways, the bedrock for that, certainly in the Western Christian context.
And no, certainly. And it's interesting you bring that up because Cringe Walker is very enamored with the Goths as a people, and he's actually made an argument that that Roman Italy was better under the Goths than it was under the later Roman Empire, which is
It's hard to argue, really. I mean, I say this as a man of Italic descent. It is hard when you actually look retrospectively. It's hard to deny that fact.
Certainly, and all I have to say is with the Gothic War, which we'll discuss next time, I think had it been conducted a little bit more differently, I think it could have led to a better outcome than what we ultimately got. But what we ended up with in our timeline, I think, was possibly the most destructive outcome, which is, okay, it's been reconquered, but the whole peninsula is like a burning wreck.
Exactly, and it's sort of one of these examples of where just enough sometimes isn't enough, and not going all in leads to an unsatisfactory half outcome that benefits nobody and harms everyone. And the Ostrogothic the war in Italy is very demonstrative of that sort of idea, that notion.
And certainly, if we bring this back to this war, so again, the reason, just in terms of the long-term consequences of the Vandalic War, the Romans reincorporate the province of Africa. This would be incredibly lucrative because Africa would bring in, I think it's something like a million gold solidi a year in tax revenue, which obviously helps fund the Byzantine war chest for future campaigns. But also, Carthage would itself hold out and remain a Roman possession until 698, when the Arab armies under Abdul Malik conquer it. So, of all of the conquest of the Renovatio Imperii, this was the most successful one ultimately, and that's largely because the campaign's so short. The Vandals are defeated in 2 quick, short, decisive battles. It's not this like long, prolonged campaign.
Indeed, I can't argue that. And what's kind of also interesting to consider is that it was definitely a risky move to imagine that the conquest of Africa would be possible with the number of troops in which was dispatched to Africa under the command of Belisarius. As a result of Justinian collecting this force, conceiving the idea, and sending them. I mean, you got to think, no more than 20,000 Roman soldiers were present in Africa at a given point in time. You got to think that the maximum strength that Belisarius really deploys is in the opening battle at Decimum, and he's got 15 to 18,000 men. And then as he makes progress across Africa, then you have the billet garrisons, and I mean, thankfully, the Vandalic kingdom did actually sort of capitulate relatively quickly, and so much of the demands placed on Justinian on Belisarius didn't really have a long-term impact of the the overarching campaign, the positive outcome for the Byzantines and for Belisarius. But not needless to say, this is actually why at ad decimum he has a relatively strong fighting force that is almost man to man with the Gothic army. Yet, I mean, you got to think in that battle he's fought in September, I think, like mid-September of 533 AD, whereas Trichomarum, sorry, is fought in December the same year of 533. I think it's December. Anyway, it's towards the end of the year. It's in the winter. Yet he's got half that number. The Vandals have 15,000, I think you said in that monologue, and then the Byzantines have 8, or these Romans have 8. So already he's like under half strength. Not that he's lost soldiers and they've suffered terrible casualties, but just because of the demands of the campaign and the fact that he's had to shed troops to defend parts of Africa that he's conquered, he just can't bring to bear his full force. And it's actually quite fortunate that the battle is as one-sided as it is, and that he loses a very, very tiny fraction of his fighting force. I mean, to lose 50 men, and even if we accept that this is embellished a little bit, right? Let's even sort of times that by, I mean, you could say even, let's even times both, times the Roman one by 10, right? So 50 becomes 500, and let's even quadruple or quintuple the Vandalic losses. That takes you to like 3,000 or 4,000. It's still a hugely lopsided affair, and so it's kind of delusional on the part of Justinian. In some ways, you think, oh well, Belisarius is this good and the kingdom's this fragile, then yeah, fine, we'll invade Italy with this number. But given that Italy was a much more populous place, and that the Ostrogoths were a more entrenched entity than the Vandalic kingdom, and there were just more Ostrogoths in Italy, they formed a larger, more powerful, sort of sizable class and a functioning elite in the former Roman Italy. I definitely think Justinian very, very much underestimated Ostrogothic power and capability in Italy, and as such, very much hamstrung Belisarius, and this unnecessarily lengthened the war. It caused unnecessary destruction to Italy, and it caused far more havoc and consternation and just general, it wrought general destruction across Italy, particularly north of like Naples and north, and particularly north of Rome, than was otherwise, necessary.
No, certainly those are fair points, which we'll get into next time. But just to wrap up this conversation, this is the high point, I think, of Belisarius' career, because he returns back to Constantinople and he's given a triumph, which, no Roman general had been given a triumph, I think, for centuries by this point. If I recall, Marcus, wasn't the last triumph like sometime in, I don't know, like the Five Good Emperors or something?
I have a feeling that was it Septimus Severus, maybe.
Well, he wasn't too long afterwards, but my point, it's been over 300 years since there's been a triumph, so it's been a long time.
Well, I was going to say whether it's a non-imperial triumph, because I mean I'm not too sure. Did Aurelian triumph himself? I can't really remember. Maybe not. Anyway, maybe you're correct. I would say it'd be around that period. I think you're quite right. I'm not too sure. I'm just thinking out loud. But either way, it's been a long time, either which way, right?
No, certainly, and so Belisarius is the hero of the hour, and as I said, he's of the highest esteem, I think, in the eyes of Justinian and the empire as a whole. That he's won this great victory at so little cost and expense. And I think another important strategic consideration is the fact that you've obviously, by taking this coastline, you've given the Romans a much greater naval command of the Mediterranean, because this map is a bit deceptive, but of course Sardinia was also a Vandal possession, and that's also taken, and the Vandals also control the city of Lilybaeum, which is on the western part of Sicily. So again, you've got all these strategic naval bases to project power throughout the Mediterranean. And I think if Africa had not been taken, I think it would have been much more difficult to have orchestrated the Gothic War.
Absolutely. I mean, not. I mean, I'm kind of being tedious here. I apologize, but just because I was looking at this map, I'm actually kind of surprised that the interior cities weren't taken by the Romans. You know, you got to think there's the Capsa in the south, Theveste, Thamgurai. Yeah, I'm just surprised that considering they would have sort of.
I know, Marcus. It's the other way around. The pink line is the Vandalic Kingdom. The purple line is the Roman territory by 541.
Thank you.
So they did conquer it.
That's okay. I'm clearly retarded. Thank you. It's good. It's like, because I know the Romans were quite fastidious about establishing like very sort of cogent, you know, defensive lines. And I was like, hang on a second, why have they drawn the border right in front of the cities? But okay, I've got the colours wrong. Never mind. Stupid me.
No, it's fine. It's a forgivable mistake. There's worse things you could have done.
Yes.
But yeah,
I was going to say it is past midnight in the colony, so I can chalk it down to tiredness.
Oh, fair enough. Well, we'll wrap that up then. We've gone for over 2 hours, and this has been a great discussion. And me and Marcus will sort out a time in the near future where hopefully we'll finish this up and get into the meat of the Gothic War in the later career, and carry on looking at this comparison with Belisarius as the Byzantium's Africanus. So there's a few super chats if you have got time, Marcus.
Oh no, I'm not in a hurry, and then I'm just going to like roll into bed when I'm done here, so I'm in no hurry. So you can go for your life. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So for super chats, we've got Hunger the Diamond Merchant for $5. Glad to see the stream and the return of Furius. Justinian would approve, and smiley face with sunglasses. Well,
Salve, Diamond Merchant, and thank you.
Dissident Knight for $10 Australian. Pertinax has been missed. Yes, he has been.
Yes, I have to like a general apology. Yeah, just IRL's been a bit mental with the farm and bits and pieces, and I mean, and that's the thing too, is that you kind of think, oh, I'll go on a holiday, you know, and like for example, as we were talking about, you know, attending, you know, Witano and everything, and it's always good fun, but then you sort of got to come back and make up time, and yeah, sadly, and as you know, Pete, I mean, I know sometimes I think particularly, I think was it part two of the Von Letter Vorbeck stream, we end up delaying for like months, just one thing after another happened. But yeah, sometimes that just happens, and I do apologize that it tends to occur this way, but I appreciate your patience because I actually really do enjoy our chats. They're good fun, and yes, I have been a bit scant, but I hope now that you know, I've been able to be more active in recent times, I can appear on a few more streams again, because I'd love to do more work in this field, as you know, Bede, and as our friends and our fans know, that this is, you know, this is what we do and this is what we love. So, you know, we may as well.
Certainly, you're always appreciated, Marcus.
Thank you, sir.
Then Hunger the Diamond Merchant again for $5. Maybe Justinian wasn't so bad after all, given the level of loyalty he inspired in his men. Also, Procopius is an SOB. This is the PFP talking. Well, yes. I wouldn't say. I think Justinian in the Machiavellian vein was more feared than loved, if I'm being honest. So,
indeed. But this is the thing too. It's like I do take Procopius fairly much at his word, and it's one of those things where you sort of balance the history with the secret history, but you can't help but wonder what was it that really set off Procopius. Was it simply because, you know, Justinian and Theodora had passed on and he was able to sort of write in an unembellished fashion? Because it's a massive U-turn from one to the other, you know.
Well, what I think is, from doing a bit of reading, because obviously I have a copy of the Secret History. In the sort of introduction to my edition, the historian Anthony Caldenis, who is a prominent sort of Byzantine historian, he sort of gives.
I love his work. It's fantastic, isn't he?
Well, I've not read much of it outside of. Yeah, he also sort of helped edit the edition of the Wars of Justinian I've got as well, so I'm sort of familiar in his help with translations, but I've not read any of his actual work itself. But I might do that one day. But yeah, something that he said in his sort of introduction to the secret history is that Procopius was a man who very much saw himself as acting in the vein of the classical ancient historians, people like Plutarch or Herodotus, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so he very much was, I think, a man who had a much more favourable opinion of, say, Athens or the Roman Republic than he did the Roman Empire. And I think he sees, Justinian as this sort of typical, Roman tyrants and the sort of degeneration of the Romans into these, Oriental despots. And I think that's kind of the angle Procopius is going with.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm.
Because it's actually funny you say that, because I, just out of curiosity, early today, I was watching a documentary about Nero and this sort of push and pull between, trying to think who is, well, obviously Seneca was one of his tutors, but also I think it was Horace, the poet. And the idea that these men who sort of had to tutor and advise people like Nero, and how in centuries afterwards, someone like Procopius would sort of look at the lot that someone like Seneca or Horace had to endure, because obviously you get someone like Tacitus who wrote afterwards and actually reflected to some degree on what happened between Nero and the tail end of what you'd call the Julio Claudians, and the relationship with Horace and Seneca. And obviously Tacitus was able to write about that because he wrote it at a different time. You got to think he was the father-in-law or brother-in-law of Agricola, the one who conquered northern England or northern Britain, campaigning against the Scots. Anyway, he was able to write at a time where he had a bit more liberty. But there were often times in Roman history where writers were not accorded that freedom to express themselves in that way and write history as they probably would have liked. And I wonder if secret history is simply a polemic against that notion, possibly.
No, I think that's true somewhat. And just to address a comment from Wrongtail Wu, I mean, Plutarch never accused anybody of killing trillions and taking their head off at night. True, but what that's my point with Procopius. Procopius feels that Justinian represents this degeneration of the, I guess, enlightened, views, if I'm going to use that term. That he's just like and again, remember, Justinian is a peasant, so Procopius thinks he's somewhat illegitimate. He's not, he's not a Roman, princeps. He's not a Roman patrician class. He's a jumped up pleb, and this is why he's unsophisticated and uncultured.
Exactly. And just two things quickly. Just pull that comments up again if you can, Bede. Yeah, if Dime Merchant, if you're still watching, we need to get one of our friends to conjure up a meme where the millions or the billions meme, but instead of the chud face, it's like a Justinian chud face as a result of killing trillions. but
Justinian after the Nika revolt, billions.
Yeah, yeah. Trying to think of how to mold. It's like Chudstinian or Chudtinian, something like that. And regarding taking the heads off at night. There is a historical comparison proven by John Zemisky's that you can take off the head of an emperor and not kill trillions. John Zemisky's coup was relatively bloodless, aside from the death of Nicephorus Phocas. So you can knock off an emperor without mass death afterwards. So anyway, I digress.
Certainly. No, fair point. And sorry, Wrongtoe Wu also sent a super chat earlier in the day, but it's disappeared from the feed. So I'm just trying to delve into my account to try and bring it up one moment.
If he's online, if he's still in the chat, just repost it. We'll mention it. Chudstinian the first. Sorry, he just written in the chat. Chudstinian.
Okay.
Love it.
I found it. Okay, glad to be back.
Okay, cool.
So Wrongtoe Wu for $10. Glad to be back myself, and more importantly, to have Marcus back, especially in these times. A man of his caliber and talent is deeply needed, as with Bede.
Thank you, much appreciated, and good to be back. Good to sharpen the sword, as it were, or in this case, the pen. But here we are.
Indeed. And there was one final super chat from Wrongtail Wu on entropy for $5. Is there something that Rome or Persia could have done to have a permanent stable border in either one's favour? Like Rome has built up Trapezuntine earlier to allow for naval transport, or the Persians have established buffer city-states. Well, you kind of have that after Trajan conquers Mesopotamia, because he turns Mesopotamia into like a buffer client kingdom, as with Armenia. So that was probably the most stable arrangement, wasn't it?
I would say so, but I think the best prospect and the worst thing is like the worst thing really is that. So I'm just trying to ponder of how to articulate this point. We were so unbelievably close to actually having an arrangement like this. You might say a friendly détente between Rome and Persia, but the circumstances would have to rise out of a situation such as Mauricius or Maurice and Khosrau, that there would have to be some kind of like intermarriage or interpersonal relationship between the emperor in Constantinople and the Shahanshah of Iran at the time, at the same time, whereby it would be genuinely friendly, which would garner or facilitate the conditions to create that. The where and the how, the logistics of it, is another matter altogether. We're talking about like Mesopotamia or having some kind of like, independent nation in between. I suppose it kind of worked with Armenia, but then Armenia became a battleground for different reasons, particularly in the case of if a Persian Shah came to power that wanted to, act against the Christianization of Armenia, because Armenia always looked to Rome for protection of its Christians. That always proved difficult, but I think Mauricius and Khosrau proved to be the best example. But the tragedy was the rebellion of Phocas, the death of Mauricius' son, which was that also Theodosius or Theodorus? I can't remember, but his son is killed along with the entirety of the royal family, and basically Khosrau is the initiation of the final and most destructive Roman-Persian War is essentially a revenge tour by Khosrau against Phocas, and this leads to both kingdoms being brought to their or both empires being brought to their knees. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just reading your reply. I've got to disagree with that one, given what Anastasius did with Seller Persia. Got the feeling it won't last long. Yeah, well, I suppose that's true. I mean, this is the point of like two superpowers butting heads against each other. It's one of those things where maybe a comparable third power was needed. Maybe we needed the survival of a Ptolemaic Egypt, or we needed some kind of Hellenic East. I suppose the Eastern Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire functioned as that Greek Roman state, but it's hard. It's hard. In the end, you can only pursue counterfactuals so far. But it's tantalizing. I mean, I was going to say, like, we've been talking about North Africa. What if a Punic republic of some kind had survived into this period? Who knows? But it's hard to imagine.
Oh no, certainly. And there's been another final super chat. Marcos588 for two $2.99. Nice one, lads. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, mate. All good. Yeah.
Plenty of Aussies in here tonight.
Old buddy of mine. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's always good. It's always encouraging. No, actually, I have to say, I've quite enjoyed the input of this. I apologize if I butcher your name. What is it? Wrong Tao Wu. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but interesting comments here about the Ottomans and the Safavids. Of course, yeah, because they basically fought over Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. And what's kind of interesting is that essentially, what's interesting is that that for the longest time, and it's mostly true, that once Seleucia and Ctesiphon were captured by the Rashidun Caliphate in the Persian Muslim War, or the Muslim conquest of Persia in the 7th century, that in essence Mesopotamia was lost. But what the Safavids actually did succeed doing for a time was to bring Mesopotamia and that eastern portion of the Fertile Crescent back into the sort of Persian Iranic sphere until they lost that territory to the Turks. I want to say it was it Murad or Mehmet? No, it was later because it was 15th century. But either which way, it was lost to the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century and remained a part. 16th century, 1500s, and remained there under the Turkish orbit until World War One. With the conquest of the Mesopotamian campaign under Allenby. So, yeah. Anyway.
Well, it's interesting because I've been doing a series on modern Iran with hunger, starting with the Safavids, and we're going up to the present day. And Mesopotamia or Iraq and Iran is interesting because the Persians care about it because Iraq contains the most important holy sites in Shia Islam, namely Najaf and Kabbalah, but also it directly borders them. But no, when you have Ismail, Ismail conquers it and holds on to it, but then his son Tomas loses it to Suleiman the Magnificent.
That's
Abbas
right.
the
Yeah.
Great then
Yeah.
retakes it in the early 17th century, but then it's lost under his grandson Safi. So there's a bit more back and forth.
Mm. Well, I was unaware of that, so thank you for offering the context. But I mean, by and large, it remains Ottoman dominated, we can say. But yeah, no, that's quite a good interjection and quite true. Yeah, because I mean, in the end, and the other thing is as well is that we see this in the modern day, whereby Iraq, what we call Iraq, quote unquote, is split along Sunni and Shia lines, and the Shias have a closer cultural and religious relationship to Iran. And for the longest time, basically from Cyrus's conquest of the Babylonian kingdom, during the Achaemenid period, up until the final loss of that territory. Who'd you say it was? Who was in the 17th century? Which Shah was it that reconquered in the 1700s?
Abbas the First or Abbas the Great. And,
Abbas.
There's two wars with the Ottomans. Both times the Ottomans trying to conquer Persian territory, and he just BTFOs them because he's modernized the Persian army. And he doesn't really conquer Iraq. He more occupies all of the major sites for many years. And when the war's concluded under his grandson Safi has to hand it back because, as you mentioned, Murad IV comes in and he is able to offset the Safavid advantage, and they get Iraq back.
Are you, just before we close, are you able to pull up? I just sent you a link in the private in here. Are you able to pull up a link and show it on screen or not, depending how you've arranged your stream? Are you able to do that?
Oh, I should be able to.
Yeah.
One moment.
So I'll talk about that line between Greek and Latin speakers. So it's the Jiricek line. And it was conceived of, it's essentially a linguistic theory that was posited by a Czech historian, Konstantin Jiricek, in 1911. And I mean, in the end, whether the line is here or there or whatever, it's hard to sort of have a definitive, it's hard to definitively say this way or that way. But essentially, this is the linguistic divide. I tend to lean probably more where the red or the yellow is more than the blue. I suppose maybe what we call modern day Albania would have been like a mixed area, because you got to think that coincides with Greek Epirus and the Tolantians and their relationship to Greece. But then at the same time, that was a part of Roman Illyricum and one of the first parts of the Adriatic brought into Rome. So who knows? But definitely Thracia, the northern parts of Macedonia and the Aegean coast, and then all the way along the Black Sea coast up past Tomis and leading up to what you call the Danubian Delta and the Crimea, sort of in that direction. Much of the coastline was Greek-speaking. It had been Greek-speaking since basically the end of the Bronze Age or the start of the Iron Age. You got to think a lot of those Greek cities on the Black Sea coast were in the Delian League and were sending Greek grain to Athens during the Peloponnesian War. So, obviously that would be Greek speaking even in this sort of period of time.
No, certainly. Thank you for sharing that, Marcus. And is there anything you want to promote or shill before we get out of here?
No, aside from the fact that who was I streamed with recently? Oh yeah, I streamed with Wandering Panda, an American bloke. We had a really nice conversation about, actually we touched on historical stuff as well, but we talked about agriculture and farming and breeds of sheep and cattle and the kind of stuff that is otherwise close to my heart, which was quite lovely. And like I said, we actually touched on a bit of history because I had to give the Americans a bit of I had to reveal to them the origins of the word Latin, because Latino is erroneous. So I had to let them know what Latium was. But it was a wonderful conversation, and I hope more people in our circles talk to Wandering Panda, because he's actually quite a wonderful chap, ex-infantryman, Midwest American, heart of gold, sold the earth, good fella. So yeah, no, that was recently. So go, if you guys are on Twitter, I think it's @Wandering Panda, give him a follow. Great chap. I think I might. I'm just trying to think now because I know. AA has spelt the end of the so-called interview era, but we've got two ideas we've been meaning to get around to. But things more urgent keep getting filed in front of us. So I don't know whether they'll make the interview period or not. We'll have to wait and see. But yeah, really, until we do part 2, my friend, I don't think we've got a whole lot planned at the moment. For me, it's just IRL stuff. I'm busy making hay and growing lambs, so a little preoccupied, but it's otherwise good.
Oh, no, thank you. And go and check out that stream Marcus did with Wandering Panda. And in terms of this channel, well, obviously, the main thing I'm working on is my series on modern Iran with hunger. The next episode will probably be in a week or two later this month. We'll be looking at Iran in World War One, which was a complete bedlam. Me and AM talked about it tangentially the other week when we were looking at the Ottoman-German alliance in World War One, but we'll go into it in more depth on that stream. And also, speaking of AM, I'm actually going to be on his channel tomorrow as a guest. And the stream topic we're going to keep secret for now, but it'll be certainly an interesting one. So stay tuned for that. It'll be 9 o'clock tomorrow night.
Nice. Just to say, I'm actually quite jealous. I actually find Persian Iranian history quite interesting. And also, as someone who studies sort of Greek and Roman history, you can't not learn about Persia tangentially because, like, between both the Greeks and the Romans, Persia just has like this indelible impact on both of them. You know, whether you're talking the Achaemenid period or the Sassanid period, Parthia, it's how can you talk about Rome without Carrhae, and how can you talk about Greece without Gaugamela? You know, it's just one of those things. But what I was going to actually mention to you is if you ever do something on the Iranian intermezzo, give me a buzz. Very fascinated with that period of time.
Well, interesting because the very first episode of the Iran series was like an episode 0. I did pre-modern Iran, so I went all the way from the Achaemenids up to the At-Kalanyu of the White Sheep Turkoman. So I did briefly talk about the Iranian intermezzo, and that period also interests me, Marcus, because I'm very interested in because the historian who actually coined that term was the Russian Orientalist Vladimir Minorsky, and he's someone I am actually very interested in because he translated Shah Ismail's poetry, which I covered in another stream. So no, he's a fellow I find interesting, and his work. So
because I've ordered a book, I'm waiting for it to arrive. It's called 2 Centuries of Silence. It was recommended to me by, funnily enough, a Persian, and I haven't got possession of it. I haven't yet read it. But yeah, I do find sort of like the struggle of the Dalamites and the sort of Zoroastrian strongholds in the Zagros Mountains and throughout Gilan and Tabaristan to be quite interesting. And also there's this sort of a bit like it's a bit like this idea that people forget, and it's one of the reasons I did it with AM, like this whole canvassing, and I've also done with Bo, like early Roman history, like the Roman kingdom, the peoples of the Italic peoples of Rome, the Sabellians, the Samnites, the Umbrians, like Rome before Rome became a prominent, never mind a world power, but a regional power, because that's the sort of part of Rome no one ever really talks about and not many people know about. And it's sort of the similar thing with Persia is, I suppose, ancient sort of Median history, Astyages and Cyrus and all that, like, it's a bit apocryphal, but it's not unknown. But there is this sort of dark period, this sort of, I want to say maybe dark's the wrong word, but between the final Persian defeat at Battle of Navahand, the final Sassanid army, and the struggle of Yazdegerd II is sort of extinguished, in the sort of middle part of the 7th century. And then what you might call like medieval Iran, basically this, I'm trying to think of the Turkish dynasty that lost to the Seljuks. Was it the Ghaznavids? I can't remember, but basically,
the Ghaznavids in Afghanistan and northwestern India and eastern Iran. Yeah,
exactly. They were defeated by the initial Turkish wave, coming through Turkmenistan and through the eastern Caspian frontier through I think the province of Gurgan, and I mean, like, there's just 200-300 years there that almost no one knows about. So yeah, anyway, I know it's a digression from Belisarius, but anyway.
Oh well, I wouldn't have it any other way. But thank you everybody for watching, and
the perils of streaming with me, mate.
Oh well, it's a peril that's worth it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Bede. Good night, fellas.
Good night.